Chapter 22 of Memories and Adventures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A Fine Voice. Memories and Adventures by Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 22. The Years Between the Wars. Constantinople. The Night of Power. A Strange Creature. Durando. Dramatic Adventures. The Congo Agitation. Olympic Games. Divorce Reform. Psychic Experience. Speculation. Years of peaceful work followed my marriage, broken only by 2 journeys to the Mediterranean, in the course of which we explored some out-of-the-way portions of Greece and visited Egypt, where I found hardly one single man left of all the good fellows whom I had once known. In the course of our travels we visited Constantinople, looking at the great guns in the forts on the Dardanelles, with little thought of all the British lives which would be sacrificed upon those low, dark, heather-clad hills which slope down to the northern shore. In Constantinople we attended the weekly Selamlik of Abdul Hamid, and saw him with his dyed beard and the ladies of his harem as they passed down to their devotions. It was an incredible sight to Western eyes to see the crowd of officers and officials, many of them fat and short of wind, who ran like dogs behind his carriage, in the hope that they might catch the imperial eye. It was Ramadan, and the old Sultan sent me a message that he had read my books, and that he would gladly have seen me, had it not been the holy month. He interviewed me through his chamberlain, and presented me with the Order of the Medjedi, and, what was more pleasing to me, he gave the Order of the Chevakat to my wife. As this is the Order of Compassion, and as my wife ever since she set foot in Constantinople had been endeavouring to feed the horde of starving dogs who roam the streets, no gift could have been more appropriate. We were admitted secretly and by very special favour into the great mosque of Sophia during the sacred festival, which is known as the Night of Power. It was a most marvellous spectacle, as from the upper circle of pillared arches we looked down upon 60,000 lighted lamps and 12,000 worshippers, who made, as they rose and fell in their devotions, a sound like the wash of the sea. The priests in their high pulpits were screaming like seagulls, and fanaticism was in the air. It was at this moment that I saw a woman, I will not call her a lady, young and flighty, seat herself jauntily on the edge of the stone parapet, and look down at the 12,000 men who were facing us. No unbeliever should be tolerated there, and a woman was the abomination of abominations. I heard a low, deep growl, and saw fierce, bearded faces looking up. It only needed one fiery spirit to head the rush, and we should have been massacred, with the poor consolation that some of us at least had really asked for it. However, she was pulled down, and we made our way as quickly and as quietly as possible out of a side door. It was time, I think. One curious incident of our journey stands out in my memory. We were steaming past Aegina on a lovely day, with calm water around us. The captain, a courteous Italian, had allowed us to go up on the bridge, and we, my wife and I, were looking down into the transparent depths, when we both clearly saw a creature which has never, so far as I know, been described by science. It was exactly like a young ichthyosaurus, about 4 feet long, with thin neck and tail and 4 marked side flippers. The ship had passed it before we could call any other observer. I was interested to notice that Admiral Anstruther in the Evening News, some years later, described and drew an exactly similar creature, which he had seen under water off the Irish coast. This old world has got some surprises for us yet. Here and there, as I look back at those long and happy years, some particular episode flashes vividly into my memory. I do not often do journalistic work. Why should one poach upon the preserves of others? But on the occasion of the Olympic Games of 1908, I was tempted, chiefly by the offer of an excellent seat, to do the marathon race for the Daily Mail. It was certainly a wonderful experience, for it will be known to history as the Durando race. Perhaps a few short paragraphs from my description may even now recapture the thrill of it. The huge crowd, some 50,000 people, were all watching the entrance to the stadium, the dark gap through which the leader must appear. Then, at last, he came, but how different from the exultant victor whom we expected. Out of the dark archway there staggered a little man with red running drawers, a tiny boy-like creature. He reeled as he entered, and faced the roar of the applause. Then he feebly turned to the left and wearily trotted round the track. Friends and encouragers were pressing round him. Suddenly the whole group stopped. There were wild gesticulations. Men stooped and rose again. Good heavens! He has fainted. Is it possible that even at this last moment the prize may slip through his fingers? Every eye slides round to that dark archway. No second man has yet appeared. Then a great sigh of relief goes up. I do not think in all that great assembly any man would have wished victory to be torn at the last instant from this plucky little Italian. He has won it. He should have it. Thank God he is on his feet again, the little red legs going incoherently, but drumming hard, driven by a supreme will within. There is a groan as he falls once more, and a cheer as he staggers to his feet. It is horrible and yet fascinating, this struggle between a set purpose and an utterly exhausted frame. Again for 100 yards he ran in the same furious and yet uncertain gait. Then again he collapsed, kind hands saving him from a heavy fall. He was within a few yards of my seat. Amid stooping figures and grasping hands I caught a glimpse of the haggard yellow face, the glazed, expressionless eyes, the lank black hair streaked across the brow. Surely he is done now. He cannot rise again. From under the archway has darted the second runner. Hayes, stars and stripes on his breast, going gallantly, well within his strength. There is only 20 yards to do, if the Italian can do it. He staggered up, no trace of intelligence upon his set face, and again the red legs broke into their strange automatic amble. Will he fall again? No. He sways, he balances, and then he is through the tape and into a score of friendly arms. He has gone to the extreme of human endurance. No Roman of the prime ever bore himself better than Durando of the Olympic of 1908. The great breed is not yet extinct. Of course the prize went to the American, as his rival had been helped, but the sympathy of the crowd, and I am sure of every sporting American present, went out to the little Italian. I not only wrote Durando up, but I started a subscription for him in the Daily Mail, which realised over £300, a fortune in his Italian village, so that he was able to start a baker's shop, which he could not have done on an Olympic medal. My wife made the presentation in English, which he could not understand. He answered in Italian, which we could not understand, but I think we really did understand each other all the same. There is no denying that the American team were very unpopular in London, though the unpopularity was not national, for the stadium was thick with American flags. Everyone admitted that they were a splendid lot of athletes, but they were not wisely handled, and I saw with my own eyes that they did things which would not have been tolerated if done by an English team in New York. However, there may well have been some want of tact on both sides, and causes at work of which the public knew nothing. When I consider the Dunraven yacht race, and then these Olympic Games, I am by no means assured that sport has that international effect for good which some people have claimed for it. I wonder whether any of the old Grecian wars had their real origin in the awards at Olympia. I may add that we had a dozen or so of the American boys down to Windlesham, where we had a very pleasant day together. I found them all excellent fellows. I put up a billiard Olympic prize, and one of them bore it off with him. The whole incident was very pleasant. My work for a few years after my marriage ran largely in the direction of drama, and if it was not lucrative, it at least provided us with a good deal of amusement and excitement. In the case of one venture, this excitement became a little too poignant, though all ended well in the end. I had dramatised Rodney Stone under the name of the House of Temperley, with all the ring scenes and prize fights included, and treated in the most realistic fashion. We had an excellent boxing instructor who took one of the smaller parts and who not only fought himself but trained the others to a remarkable degree of skill. So realistic was it that when on the first night the bully, Burks, after a long encounter, went down with a crash from a fine raking uppercut, there was an involuntary groan from the whole house, which meant as clearly as could be, "There now, you have killed a man for our amusement." It was really incredibly well done, and I could never have believed that such scenes could be so cleverly faked, though it was not always done with impunity, for Rex Davis, who played Gloucester Dick, assured me that he lost a tooth and broke both a finger and a rib during his engagement. The play itself was unequal, but was so very novel and sensational in its best scenes that it should have been a considerable success. I found no manager who would take the risk, and I had myself to take the Adelphi Theatre for a 6 months' lease, at a rent which, with the company, worked out at about £600 a week. As on the top of this the production cost about £2,000, it will be seen that I was plunging rather deep. And luck did not favour us. The furore for boxing had not yet set in. Ladies were afraid to come and imagined it would be a brutal spectacle. Those who did come were exhilarated beyond measure, but the prejudice still weighed heavily against us. Then there came one of those theatrical slumps when everything goes wrong, and finally King Edward died, and that killed it outright. It was a very serious situation. I still had the theatre upon my hands. I might sublet it or I might not. If I did not, the expense was simply ruinous. It was under these circumstances that, as I have already said, I wrote and rehearsed The Speckled Band in record time, and so saved the situation. The real fault of this play was that in trying to give Holmes a worthy antagonist, I overdid it and produced a more interesting personality in the villain. The terrible ending was also against it. However, it was a considerable success and saved a difficult, almost a desperate situation. Yet another theatrical venture was my Fires of Fate, some of which is certainly the best dramatic work that I have ever done. It was unlucky, as it was produced in a very hot summer. I carried it at my own expense through the 2 impossible holiday months, but when Lewis Waller, who played the hero, returned from a provincial tour to London, he was keen on some new play, and my fires were never really burned out. I fancy sometimes that they might even now flame up again if given a chance. I stage managed most of this play myself, and with curious results. There are certain dramatic conventionalities which can only be broken through by one who is not himself an actor. There was a scene where a number of helpless tourists, men and women, were brutally ill-treated by Arabs. The brutality in rehearsal was conventional. I made the Arabs get imitation whips and cudgels and really savaged the poor travellers. The effect was novel and appalling. There was a young Welsh officer in the front of the stalls who was a friend of my brother's. He held both the VC and the DSO. So stirred was he by the sight that he could hardly be restrained from clambering onto the stage in order to help the unhappy tourists. The end of that act, when the drove of bleeding captives are led away, and you hear the monotonous song of the Arabs as they march, and you see Lewis Waller, who has been left for dead, struggle up on his elbow and signal across the Nile for assistance, was one which brought the whole house to its feet. Such moments to a dramatist give a thrill of personal satisfaction, such as the most successful novelist never can feel. There is no more subtle pleasure, if you are really satisfied with your work, than to sit in the shadow of a box and watch not the play but the audience. I had one other dramatic venture, Brigadier Gerard, which also was mildly successful. In fact, I have never known failure on the stage, save in the case of the unfortunate Jane Annie. Lewis Waller played the Brigadier, and a splendid dashing hussar he made. It was a glorious performance. I remember that in this play also I ran up against the conventionalities of the stage. I had a group of hussar officers, the remnants of the regiment which had gone through Napoleon's last campaign. When it came to the dress rehearsal, I found them, to my horror, dressed up in brand new uniforms, of chestnut and silver. "Good heavens!" I cried, "this is not a comic opera." "What do you want done?" asked Waller. "Why," said I, "these men are warriors, not ballet dancers. They have been out in all weathers, day and night, for months. Every scrap of truth goes out of the play if they appear like that. The uniforms had cost over £100, but I covered them with mud and dust and tore holes in them. The result was that with begrimed faces I got a band of real Napoleonic soldiers. Waller himself insisted on retaining his grease paint and his nice new clothes. But I am sure every man in the audience, if not every woman, would have liked him better, as I had made the others. Poor Lewis Waller! There was some strange and wonderful blood in his veins. He was a glorious fellow, and his premature death a great blow to our stage. What virility! What a face and figure! They called him the flapper's idol, and it reflects credit on the flapper, for where could she find a less sickly and more manly type? He caught his fatal illness in serving the soldiers. One of his greatest possessions was his voice. He came down to Windlesham once, and as he was reciting in the music room that wonderful resonant voice chanced to catch the exact note, which corresponded to the curve of all the glass lampshades on the walls. They all started thrilling as a wine-glass does when it is touched. I could quite believe after that matter could be disintegrated by sound, if the sound was strong enough. I am not clear what blood ran in Waller's veins, Hebrew or Basque or both. I only know that it went to make a very wonderful man. His intense feeling about everything that he did was one of his characteristics, and no doubt a cause of his success. It did not carry him far in golf, however. I remember hearing him as he approached the last tee mutter, "God, give me one good drive." I fear, however, that the betting was against it. In 1910 a fresh task opened up before me. It arose from my being deeply moved by reading some of the evidence concerning the evil rule, not of Belgium, but of the King of the Belgians in the Congo. I examined this evidence carefully before I accepted it, and I assured myself that it was supported by 5 British consuls and by Lord Cromer, as well as by travellers of many races, Belgian, French, American, Swedish and others. An attempt has been made since to minimise the facts and to pretend that Roger Casement had been at the back of the agitation for sinister purposes of his own. This contention is quite untenable, and the evidence for the atrocities is overwhelming, and from very many sources, the Belgians themselves being among the best witnesses. I put in some 2 years working with Mr. Morel and occasionally lecturing in the country upon this question, and it was certainly the efforts of the Congo Association which we represented that eventually brought the question to the notice of that noble man, King Albert, which meant setting it right so that the colony is now, so far as I know, very well managed. Casement, whom I shall always regard as a fine man afflicted with mania, has met his tragic end, and Morel's views upon the war have destroyed the feelings which I had for him, but I shall always maintain that they both did noble work in championing the wrongs of those unhappy and helpless Negroes. My own book, The Crime of the Congo, which was translated into all European languages, had also, I hope, some influence towards that end. In the early summer of 1912 I had a telegram from Lord Northcliffe, which let me in for about as much trouble as any communication which I have ever received. It was to the effect that Britain must regain her place among the athletic nations which had been temporarily eclipsed by the Olympic Games at Stockholm, and that I was the one man in Great Britain who could rally round me the various discordant forces which had to be united and used. This was very complimentary, but it was Lord Northcliffe's sole contribution to the matter for a very long time, and I was left to my own devices entirely in carrying out a complex task. So badly coordinated were Northcliffe's papers that I had some of them actually attacking me while I was working on their chief's suggestion. When I examined, I found chaos. On the one hand was the British Olympic Committee, a most sound and respectable body under Lord Desborough. In some ways they had lost touch with press and public, and were generally in disfavour, though really they had done their best. On the other hand was the Times, which had worked itself into a fury about the misdeeds of the committee, and had set a tone which poisoned the whole press against them. Lord Northcliffe would have nothing to do with anything which emanated from the committee. The committee defied Lord Northcliffe. It was clear that this had to be cleared up as a preliminary. and the matter took enough diplomacy to have settled the Balkan question. I called upon the committee and suggested that an independent body be formed on which they could be represented. To this they agreed. I then called on the Times and said, "You are no longer dealing with the old Olympic Committee, but with a new body. Do you agree to this?" Yes, that was all in order. I may have omitted the trifling fact that the new body did not yet exist. I then asked Mr. Studd, the famous cricketer of old and head of the Polytechnic, to help me to form the new body. We soon had a very effective one, including several leading athletes and Lord Forster, now Governor-General of Australia. I served, of course, on the committee, and soon we were in touch with everyone and all promised to go smoothly. But presently a huge mistake was made. I don't wish to represent myself as the founder of all wisdom, and no doubt I make as many slips as my fellows, but that particular one would never have been made had I been present. But I was called away and was out of the country at that crucial committee meeting. It had been already determined that an appeal to the public over all our names should be issued. The amount had not been discussed, but in my own mind I had thought that £10,000 would suffice. I was horrified, therefore, when I returned from my holiday, to find that they had appealed for £100,000. The sum was absurd, and at once brought upon us from all sides the charge of developing professionalism. My position was very difficult. If I protested now, it would go far to ruin the appeal. After all, it might succeed. I could only fall into line with the others and do my best for the sake of the cause to defend a policy which I looked upon as mistaken. We actually collected about £7,000, and finally, as we found that the general feeling was either hostile or apathetic, we handed over this sum to the Olympic Committee. Then came the war, and so in any case our labour was in vain, for the Games were to be in Berlin in 1916. We were all playing another game by then. This matter was spread over a year of my life and was the most barren thing that I ever touched, for nothing came of it, and I cannot trace that I ever received one word of thanks from any human being. I was on my guard against Northcliffe telegrams after that. I remember one curious episode about that time. I was staying in a Northumberland Avenue hotel, and I walked out at night in pensive mood, strolling down the embankment and watching the great dark river with the gleam of the lights upon it. Suddenly a man passed me, walking very rapidly and muttering in an incoherent way. He gave me an impression of desperation, and I quickened my pace and followed him. With a rush he sprang up on the parapet and seemed to be about to throw himself into the river. I was just in time to catch his knees and to pull him down. He struggled hard to get up, but I put my arm through his and led him across the road. There I reasoned with him and examined into the cause of his troubles. He had had some domestic quarrel, I believe, but his main worry was his business, which was that of a baker. He seemed a respectable man, and the case seemed genuine, so I calmed him down, gave him such immediate help as I could, and made him promise to return home and to keep in touch with me afterwards. When the excitement of the incident was over, I had grave doubts as to whether I had not been the victim of a clever swindler. I was considerably relieved, therefore, to get a letter a few days later, giving name and address, and obviously genuine. I lost sight of the case after that. Another matter which preoccupied me much in the years before the war, and preoccupies me still, is the reform of our divorce laws. I was president of the Reform Union for 10 years, and have only just vacated the position in order to make room for a far more efficient successor in Lord Birkenhead. I am quite alive to all the arguments of our opponents, and quite understand that laxity in the marriage tie is an evil, but I cannot understand why England should lag behind every other Protestant country in the world, and even behind Scotland, so that unions which are obviously disgusting and degrading are maintained in this country, while they can be dissolved in our colonies or abroad. As to morality, I cannot, I fear, admit that our morality here is in the least better than in Scandinavia, Holland, or Germany, where they have more rational laws. I think that in some states in America they have pushed divorce to an extreme, but even in America I should say that married happiness and morality generally are quite as high as with us. The House of Lords has shown itself to be more liberal in this matter than the Commons, possibly because the latter have a fear of organised church influence in their constituencies. One of several questions which makes me not sorry to see Labour, with its larger outlook, in power for a time in this country. Our marriage laws, our land laws, the cheapening of justice, and many other things have long called out for reform, and if the old parties will not do it, then we must seek some new one which will. During these long and happy years when the smooth current of our national life was quietly sliding towards Niagara, I did not lose my interest in psychic matters, but I cannot say that I increased my grasp of the religious or spiritual side of the subject. I read, however, and investigated whenever the chance arose. A gentleman had arranged a series of psychical séances in a large studio in North London, and I attended them, the mediums being Cecil Husk and Craddock. They left a very mixed impression upon my mind, for in some cases I was filled with suspicion, and in others I was quite sure that the result was genuine. The possibility that a genuine medium may be unscrupulous, and that when these very elusive forces fail to act, he may simulate them, is one which greatly complicates the whole subject. But one can only concentrate upon what one is sure is true, and try to draw conclusions from that. I remember that many sheeted ghosts walked about in the dim light of a red lamp on these occasions, and that some of them came close to me, within a foot of my face, and illuminated their features by the light of a phosphorescent slate held below them. One splendid Arab, whom the medium called Abdullah, came in this fashion. He had a face like an idealized W.G. Grace, swarthy, black-bearded and dignified, rather larger than human. I was looking hard at this strange being, its nose a few inches from my own, and was wondering whether it could be some very clever bust of wax, when in an instant the mouth opened and a terrific yell was emitted. I nearly jumped out of my chair. I saw clearly the gleaming teeth and the red tongue. It certainly seemed that he had read my thought and had taken this very effective way of answering it. Some of the excitements of my life during these and the subsequent years were due to financial entanglements which arose from a certain speculative element in my own nature, depending rather upon the love of adventure than upon any hope of gain. If, when I earned money, I had dug a hole in the garden and buried it there, I should be a much richer man today. I can hardly blame the punter on the racecourse when I remember the outside chances which I have taken in the past in every possible form of speculation. But I have the advantage over the mere gambler in this, that every pound of my money went to develop something or other and line the pocket of the working man, who, by the way, when he grumbles over the profits of the capitalist, never even alludes to his losses. If a balance sheet were struck, it would be interesting to see what, if any, is the exact margin of profit. It is true that sometimes I have indulged in a pure gamble, but never for any sum which would hurt me. I have painful memories of a guano island off South Africa, on which our treasure-seekers were not even allowed to land, though every bird's nest was rumoured to contain a diamond. The Spanish galleon in the Bay of Tobermory also took treasure rather than gave it, and the return for my shares was a lump of glass and a rusted bar. That was more than ever I had from certain spots in Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie and other alleged gold-bearers, which have nearly all been gold consumers so far as I am concerned. I fear some of those mines were like that legendary one where the manager, getting a cable which ordered him to start crushing, replied, "I have nothing to crush until you return samples." I have played my involuntary part also in the development of the Rand and Rhodesia, from those early and unsophisticated days when I misread the quotation and, meaning to invest £60, was faced next morning with a bill for £900. Occasionally it is true that I backed a winner, but as a rule I must confess that I was not judicious in my selections. But it was at home that I expended myself most freely. I saw the enormous possibilities of Kent coal, which even now are not fully understood, but I did not sufficiently weigh the impossibilities, which are that an enterprise can be successful which is wildly financed and extravagantly handled. I and many others lost our money, sinking the shafts which may bring fortunes to our successors. I even descended 1,000 feet through the chalk to see with my own eyes that the coal was in situ. It seems to have had the appearance and every other quality of coal, save that it was incombustible, and when a dinner was held by the shareholders, which was to be cooked by local coal, it was necessary to send out and buy something which would burn. There were, however, lower strata which were more sensitive to heat. Besides Kent coal, I lost very heavily in running a manufacturing plant in Birmingham, into which I was led by those successive stages in which you are continually trying to save what you have already invested until the situation becomes so serious that you drop it in terror. We turned from bicycles to munitions during the war and actually worked hard the whole 4 years, with 100 artisans making needful war material without ever declaring a penny of dividend. This, I should think, must be a record, and at least no one could call us profiteers. The firm was eventually killed dead by the successive strikes of the moulders and the miners. It is amazing how one set of workmen will ruin another set, without apparently any remonstrance from the sufferers. Another bad egg was a sculpture machine for architectural work, which really had great possibilities, but we could not get the orders. I was chairman of this company, and it cost me 2 years of hard work and anxiety, ending up by my paying the balance out of my own pocket so that we might wind up in an honourable way. It was a dismal experience with many side adventures attached to it, which would make a sensational novel. Such are some of the vicissitudes which cannot be disregarded in a retrospect of life, for they form a very integral and absorbing part of it. I have had my ill luck, and I have had my good. Amid the latter, I count the fact that I have been for 21 years a director of Raphael Tuck & Co., without the least cloud to darken the long and pleasant memory. I have also been for many years chairman of Besson's famous brass instrument firm. I think a man should know all sides of life, and he has missed a very essential side if he has not played his part in commerce. In investments, too, I would not imply that I have always been unfortunate. My speculative adventures are over, and I can at least say that unless the British Empire goes down, I shall be able to retain enough for our modest needs. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Memories and Adventures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by a fine voice. Memories and Adventures by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 23. Some Notable People. President Roosevelt, Lord Balfour, Mr. Asquith, Lord Haldane, George Meredith, Rudyard Kipling, James Barrie, Henry Irving, Bernard Shaw, R.L.S., Grant Allen, James Payn, Henry Thompson, Royalty. When I have chanced during my life to come in contact with notable people, I have often made some short record at the time of what they said and how they impressed me. It is difficult, however, to use these notes for publication when you happen to have been a guest, and it can only be done, I think, by using one's judgment and never consciously harming one's host. If everyone were altogether silent upon such occasions, the most pleasing side of great contemporaries would never be chronicled, for the statesman in slippers is a very much more human and lovable person than the politician on the platform. Among the great men that I have known, President Roosevelt occupied a prominent place. He was not a big, nor, so far as one could see, a powerful man, but he had tremendous dynamic force and an iron will which may account for his reputation as an athlete. He had all the simplicity of real greatness, speaking his mind with great frankness and in the clearest possible English. He had in him a great deal of the boy, a mischievous, adventurous, high-spirited boy with a deep, strong, thoughtful manhood in the background. We were present, my wife and I, at the Guildhall when he made his memorable speech about Egypt, in which he informed a gathering which contained the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, and many of our cabinet, that we should either rule more strictly or clear out altogether. It was, of course, a most unwarrantable intrusion into our affairs, but it was a calculated indiscretion, and very welcome, I believe, to those who were dealing with Egypt. As he made his way through the dense crowd afterwards, he passed me and said with a grin, "I say, I let them have it at that time, didn't I? There was the mischievous boy coming out." He had a quick, blunt wit which showed itself often in his metaphors. He spoke to me, I remember, of someone who had a 9 guinea-pig power brain. One of his entourage told me how the President had been awakened once to address some prairie folk at a wayside station. "They have come 60 miles to see you," said his secretary. "They would have come 100 to see a cat with 2 heads," said the ruffled President. I met him once at a small luncheon party at the invitation of Lord Lee, who had soldiered with him in Cuba. He was extremely talkative. In fact, I can hardly remember anyone else saying anything. Thinking it over afterwards, I concluded that 2 ideas were running through his mind, and every now and then coming to the surface. They were formidable ideas, and may have been some temporary wave of feeling, but they were certainly in his thoughts. The one was that there would be another civil war in the States. The second, that if you had the farmer class on your side, they presented the best military material. From this I gathered that it was not a geographical but an economic struggle that was in his mind. Absit omen, but great men are often pessimists, and the Duke of Wellington was deeply convinced that Britain could not long survive his death. When Roosevelt was shot, I sent him a cable to express that sympathy which every Englishman felt. I have his answer before me, written only a day or so after the event. Mercy Hospital, Chicago, October 19th, 1912. Dear Mr. Doyle, many thanks for your kind message of sympathy. As you know, a bullet wound is rather a serious thing, but all conditions seem to be favourable, and I hope in a few days we will all be relieved from anxiety. Sincerely yours, Theodore Roosevelt. It is typewritten, but signed by his own hand. I do not think that a more brave and detached letter was ever written by a sufferer. Roosevelt was a very loud, hearty man, with a peculiar wild beast, toothy grin, and an explosive habit of slapping his hand down for emphasis. I jotted down a few of his obiter dicta after our conversation. He had no good word for Henry James. He is not a whole man. All that subtlety is really decadence. He was very virile, not to say heroic, in his views. A man should guard particularly against being led from his duty, especially a dangerous duty, by his women. I guess a woman would have had a bad time if she had tried to lead Leonidas from the pass. Of the German emperor he said that he was jealous of the king's dog at the king's funeral because he attracted the more notice. Altogether he was one of the raciest talkers I have ever met. Among the occasional great ones of earth whom I have met, there is hardly anyone who stands out more clearly than Arthur Balfour, with his willowy figure, his gentle intellectual face, and, as I read it, his soul of steel. I should think that of all men of our day, he was the last who would be turned from any path which he had deliberately taken. But on the other hand he was capable of standing a most unconscionable time at the place where paths divide, for his mind was so subtle and active that he would always see the 2 sides of every question and waver between them. He could never have been a pioneer. The occasion of our first meeting was a most ridiculous one. Old Lord Burnham, the first of his line, had invited me down to his country house at Beaconsfield, a wonderful house which had been built originally by Waller, the royalist poet. Burke had lived close by, and the dagger which, in a melodramatic moment, he threw upon the floor of the house, in order to show the dangers of French Republican propaganda, is still on exhibition. I can remember the party well, though nearly all of them are now on the farther side. I see Lady Dorothy Neville, with her mittened hands and her prim pussy-cat manner, retailing gossip about Disraeli's flirtations. Sir Henry James walks under the trees with bended head, talking to the rising barrister who is destined, as Lord Reading, to be Viceroy of India. Lady Cleveland, mother of Lord Rosebery, is listening with her old face wreathed in smiles to Lady Dorothy's scandal. Young Harry Irving looks unutterably bored as Lord Burnham explains golf to him, bending his head over to get a glimpse of the ball round the curve of his goodly waistcoat. Mr. Asquith stands smiling beside them. As one looks back, they seem all to have been shadows in a world of shadow. Lord Burnham's hobby was Turkish baths, and he had an excellent one in the front of the house, the drawing-room being the first door on the right as one entered, and being a simple sitting-room as far as appearance went. With his usual kind hospitality, Lord Burnham had urged me to try his bath, and having done so I was placed, arrayed in a long towel, and with another towel screwed round my head, in the drawing-room. Presently the door opened and entered Arthur Balfour, Prime Minister of England. He knew nothing of the house or its ways, and I can remember the amazement with which he gazed at me. Lord Burnham, following at his heels, introduced me, and I raised the towel on my head. There were no explanations, and I felt that he went away with the impression that this was my usual costume. I did not see him after that weekend. He kept his room, I remember, until midday on the Sunday, until some years later, when after heavy domestic loss, I was endeavouring to collect myself again in a little inn near Dunbar. He heard of my presence, and in his kindness sent a car over from Whittinghame, only a few miles away, with a request that I should come over for a couple of days. There were present his brother, Gerald Balfour, a man with a beautifully refined face and manner, not unlike that of Andrew Lang. His wife is the famous Lady Betty Balfour, the daughter of Lord Lytton. When one thinks of that group of inter-allied families, the Balfours, Cecils, Sedgwicks and Lyttons, it seems a sort of nerve ganglion of British life. There was also Lady Frances Balfour, who was a daughter of the Duke of Argyll, and not unlike him, as I can remember him. Her husband was Arthur Balfour's brother, an architect and antiquary, while another brother was Colonel of the London Scottish. Finally, there was Miss Alice Balfour, a very sweet and gentle intellectual person who was my actual hostess. I found Arthur Balfour in great spirits because he had just won a golf medal at North Berwick. He seemed as pleased as any schoolboy, and his sister told me that no political success ever gave him the keen pleasure which he had from his golf victory. He was an average player, orthodox in style, and about 10 or 12 in handicap. He proved to be a charming host, for he was a good listener, seeming to be really eager to hear your opinion, laughed heartily at small provocation, and talked always very frankly and modestly of himself. After my long solitude I was more loquacious, I remember, than is my way, but he bore it with good humour. Every night, or at least on the Sunday night, the whole staff of the large rambling establishment, maids and grooms, some 20 in all, came in for prayers, which were read by the head of the house. It was fine to hear groom and statesman praying humbly together that they be forgiven the sins of the day, and merging all earthly distinctions in the presence of that which is above us all. He was very interesting when he spoke of the outrage which the Russian fleet had committed when, on their way to Japan, they opened fire at the British trawlers on the Dogger Bank. It was curious to hear his gentle voice and to note his listless impersonal manner while he spoke in this fashion. I was very angry, really very angry about that affair. If our fleet had been at home, I should have been inclined to have stopped them in the Straits. Of course, one would not do that unless one had an overpowering force, so as to avoid bloodshed and save the Russian face. Their ambassador called that morning and gave complete assurances, or really I should have had to do something. He got himself into trouble with his own government, who felt that he had given away their case. I asked him how cabinet councils were worked. He said that they voted upon points and went by majorities, unless it was a vital thing, when of course the dissenters must resign. I observed in his character a very great horror of cowardice. Nothing seemed to arouse such scorn in him. He grew quite red, I remember, as he spoke of Lord George Sackville, and realised that, though he had been broken and should have been shot at the Battle of Minden in 1759, he was none the less Minister of War during the American campaign. He was also, as I reminded him, a most debauched man, and the murder of his mistress, Miss Ray, the actress, by her true lover, the clergyman Hackman, was one of the causes célèbres of that century. I shall always carry away the memory of that visit, a bright gleam in a dark passage of life. I see very clearly the old house, the huge broken tree outside, inside which a state conspiracy was once hatched, the fine library with its wealth of French memoirs, and above all the remarkable man who stood for so much in the life of the country. I was not at that time so convinced of the primary importance of psychic things as I became later, and I regret it, as this would have been my one opportunity to explore a knowledge which at that time was certainly greater than my own. Years later, when the fight was heavy upon me, and when I was almost alone in the polemical arena, I wrote to Mr. Balfour and charged him with sharing all my convictions, and yet leaving me to defend them single-handed. His answer was, "Surely my opinions upon this subject are already sufficiently well known," which is surely an admission that I was right in my description of them, and yet was not much of a prop to me in my time of need. I cast my mind back to other statesmen whom I have known, and Mr. Asquith's kindly personality comes into my memory. I remember playing a round of golf with him once, and a very bad player he was, but his conversation as we went round was +4. He was a naturally sweet-natured man, but under that gentleness there lay judgment and firmness, as was shown at the great crisis of history. He never said too much, but what he did say he lived up to. In conducting us safely through those first 2 years of war, he did that for which he has never had sufficient credit, and the more light we have had since, the more clear it has been that Lord Kitchener and he were really doing all that men could do in munition work and all other ways. Because he had the solid Yorkshire stolidity, more nervous and excitable people thought that he did not take the war sufficiently seriously, while the constant lies about the pro-German tendencies of his wife increased the evil impression. We owe him a reparation which is second only to that which is due to Lord Haldane, and that is indeed a heavy one. If one man could be named who was absolutely indispensable to victory, it was Haldane. He it was who built up the whole splendid weapon which flashed so swiftly from its sheath, and which Germany was so amazed to find directed at its breast as it rushed forward upon its furious course. He could not work miracles. He could not introduce conscription when a candidate with such a programme would have been chased from the hustings. He could not prepare the public mind in some dramatic way which would have precipitated the very crash which there was still some chance of avoiding. But all we had he gave us, the 8 divisions which saved France, the territorials who carried on the good work until the new armies were ready, and the officers' training corps which strengthened us where we should have been fatally weak. There has never been so foolish and ungrateful a clamour as that which has been raised against Haldane. I remember that when he took the chair for me in the first war lecture which I gave in London, there were cries of "Traitor!" from people, chiefly women, among the audience. I had never seen Haldane before, and have never seen him since, so I have no personal bias in the matter, but I am proud that it was in my first volume of the History of the War, published in 1915, that I first put forward the unpopular view which will now be more fully accepted. With George Meredith I had several interesting connections. I have the greatest possible admiration for him at his best, while his worst is such a handicap that I think it will drag 4/5 of his work to oblivion. If his own generation finds him hard to understand, what will our descendants make of him? He will be a cult among a few, a precious few in every sense, and yet I fully recognise that his was the most active original brain and the most clever pen of any man novelist or otherwise of my time. Knowing this well, it is strange that I can see so limited a future for him. His subtle and intricate mind seemed unable to realise the position of the plain outsiders who represent the world. He could not see how his stained glass might be less effective than the plain transparent substance as a medium for vision. The first requisite is to be intelligible. The second is to be interesting. The third is to be clever. Meredith enormously filled the third, but he was unequal upon the other two. Hence he will never, in spite of the glories of Richard Feverel, be on an equality with Dickens or Thackeray, who filled all three. He had simply no idea how his words would strike a less complex mind. I remember that once, in the presence of Barry, Quiller Couch and myself, he read out a poem which he had inscribed "To the British Working Man" in the Westminster Gazette. I don't know what the British working man made of it, but I am sure that we three were greatly puzzled as to what it was about. I had written some articles on his work, which had been one of my youthful cults, and that led to his inviting me to see him at his villa at Box Hill, the first of several such visits. There had been a good deal in the papers about his health, so that I was surprised when, as I opened the garden gate, a slight but robust gentleman in a grey suit and a red tie swung out of the hall door and came singing loudly down the path. I suppose he was getting on to 70 at the time, but he looked younger, and his artistic face was good to the eye. Greeting me, he pointed to a long steep hill behind the house and said, "I have just been up to the top for a walk." I looked at the sharp slope and said, "You must be in good trim to do it." He looked angry and said, "That would be a proper compliment to pay to an octogenarian." I was a little nettled by his touchiness, so I answered, I understood that I was talking to an invalid. It really seemed as if my visit would terminate at the garden gate, but presently he relented, and we soon became quite friendly. He had in his youth been a judge of wine, and had still a reverence for a good vintage, but unfortunately some nervous complaint from which he suffered had caused the doctors to prohibit it absolutely. When lunch came round, he asked me with a very earnest air whether I could undertake to drink a whole bottle of Burgundy. I answered that I saw no insuperable difficulty. A dusty old bottle was tenderly carried up, which I disposed of, Meredith taking a friendly interest in its dispatch. "The fact is," said he, "I love my wine, and my little cellar was laid down with care and judgment, so that when some guest comes and drinks a glass and wastes the rest of the bottle, it goes to my heart. It really did me good to see you enjoy that one." I need not say that I intimated that I was always prepared to oblige. His conversation was extraordinarily vivid and dramatic, uttered in a most vehement tone. It may have been artificial and it may have been acting, but it was very arresting and entertaining. The talk got upon Napoleon's marshals, and you would have thought that he knew them intimately, and he did Murat's indignation at being told to charge au bout, as if he ever charged any other way, in a fashion which would have brought down the house. Every now and then he brought out a Meredithian sentence, which sounded comic when applied to domestic matters. When the jelly swayed about as the maid put it on the table, he said, "The jelly, Mary, is as treacherous as the Trojan horse." He laughed when I told him how my groom, enlisted as a waiter for some special dinner, said, "Hud up there," to the jelly under similar circumstances. After lunch we walked up a steep path to the little chalet or summer house where he used to write. He wished to read me a novel which he had begun 20 years before, but which he had not had the heart to go on with. I liked it greatly, and we roared with laughter at his description of an old sea-dog, who turned up the collar of his coat when he went into action as if the bullets were rain. He said that my hearty enjoyment encouraged him to go on with it, and it has since appeared as The Amazing Marriage, but whether I really had anything to do with it, I do not know. I should be proud to think so. The nervous complaint from which he suffered caused him to fall down occasionally. As we walked up the narrow path to the chalet, I heard him fall behind me, but judged from the sound that it was a mere slither and could not have hurt him. Therefore I walked on as if I had heard nothing. He was a fiercely proud old man, and my instincts told me that his humiliation in being helped up would be far greater than any relief I could give him. It was certainly a nice point to decide. George Meredith's religious convictions were very difficult to decide. He certainly had no glimmering, so far as I could see, of any psychic element in life, and I should imagine that on the whole he shared the opinions of his friend John Morley, which were completely negative. And yet I remember his assuring me that prayer was a very necessary thing, and that one should never abandon prayer. Who rises from prayer a better man, his prayer is granted, says the aphorist in Richard Feverel. How far these positions can be harmonized I do not know. I suppose that one may say that God is unknown, and yet rear a mental temple to the unknown God. Rudyard Kipling I know far less than I should, considering how deeply I admire his writings, and that we live in the same country. But we are both absorbed in work, and both much away from home, which may explain it. I can well remember how eagerly I bought his first book, Plain Tales, in the old South Sea days, when buying a book was a rare strain upon my exchequer. I read it with delight and realized not only that a new force had arisen in literature, but that a new method of story writing had appeared, which was very different from my own adherence to the careful plot artfully developed. This was go as you please, take it or leave it work, which glowed suddenly up into an incandescent phrase or paragraph, which was the more effective for its sudden advent. In form, his stories were crude, and yet in effect, which after all is everything, they were superb. It showed me that methods could not be stereotyped, and that there was a more excellent way, even if it were beyond my reach. I loved the Barrack Room Ballads also, and such poems as the Bolivar, East and West, and above all the badly named L'Envoi, became part of my very self. I always read the last one aloud to my little circle before we start on any fresh expedition, because it contains the very essence of travel, romance, and high adventure. I saw Kipling most nearly in his very early days when he lived at Brattleboro, a little village in Vermont, in a chivalrous desire to keep his newly married wife in touch with her own circle. In 1894, as I have recorded, there was a good deal of tail-twisting going on in the States, and Kipling pulled a few feathers out of the eagle's tail in retaliation, which caused many screams of protest, for the American was far more sensitive to such things than the case-hardened Briton. I say was, for I think as a nation, with an increased assurance of their own worth and strength, they are now more careless of criticism. The result at the time was to add oil to flames, and I, as a passionate believer in Anglo-American union, wrote to Kipling to remonstrate. He received my protest very good-humouredly, and it led to my visit to his country home. As a matter of fact, the concern shown in America, when the poet lay at death's door a few years later, showed that the rancour was not very deep. Perhaps he was better known at that time in America than in England, for I remember sitting beside a bushman in London who bowed his red face to my ear and said, "Beg your pardon, sir, but who is this here Kilpin?" I had 2 great days in Vermont, and have a grateful remembrance of Mrs. Kipling's hospitality. The poet read me MacAndrew's hymn, which he had just done, and surprised me by his dramatic power, which enabled him to sustain the Glasgow accent throughout, so that the angular Scottish greaser simply walked the room. I had brought up my golf clubs and gave him lessons in a field, while the New England rustics watched us from afar, wondering what on earth we were at, for golf was unknown in America at that time. We parted good friends, and the visit was an oasis in my rather dreary pilgrimage as a lecturer. My glimpses of Kipling since then have been few and scattered, but I had the pleasure several times of meeting his old father, a most delightful and lovable person, who told a story quite as well as his famous son. As the mother was also a very remarkable woman, it is no wonder that he carried such a cargo. James Barrie is one of my oldest literary friends, and I knew him within a year or two of the time when we both came to London. He had just written his Window in Thrums, and I, like all the world, acclaimed it. When I was lecturing in Scotland in 1893, he invited me to Kirriemuir, when I stayed some days with his family, splendid types of the folk who have made Scotland great. His father was a fine fellow, but his mother was wonderful with a head and a heart, rare combinations which made me class her with my own mother. Kirriemuir could by no means understand Barrie's success, and looked upon their great son as an inexplicable phenomenon. They were acutely aware, however, that tourists were arriving from all parts to see the place, on account of Barrie's books. "I suppose you have read them," I said to the wife of the local hotel man. "Aye, I've read them, and steep, weary work it was," said she. She had some theory that it was a 4-horse coach which her good man was running, and not the books at all which accounted for the boom. Great as are Barrie's plays, and some of them I think are very great, I wish he had never written a line for the theatre. The glamour of it and the, to him, easy success have diverted from literature the man with the purest style of his age. Plays are always ephemeral, however good, and are limited to a few, but Barrie's unborn books might have been an eternal and a universal asset of British literature. He has the chaste clarity which is the great style, which has been debased by a generation of wretched critics, who have always confused what is clear with what is shallow, and what is turbid with what is profound. If a man's thought is precise, his rendering of it is precise, and muddy thoughts make obscure paragraphs. If I had to make my choice among modern stylists, I should pick Barrie for the lighter forms of expression, and our British Winston Churchill for the more classical. Barrie's great play, one of the finest in the language, is of course the admirable Crichton. I shall always hope that I had a hand in the fashioning of it. I say this not in complaint but in satisfaction, for we all drop seeds into each other, and seldom know whence they come. We were walking together on the heath at Kirriemuir when I said, "I had a quaint thought in the night, Barrie. It was that a king was visiting India, and was wrecked on the way on some island far from the track of ships. Only he and one rather handy sailor were saved. They settled down to spend their lives together. Of course the result would be that the sailor would become the king, and the king the subject. We chuckled over the idea, and when Crichton appeared, I seemed to see the fine plant which had grown from the tiny seed. Barrie and I had one unfortunate venture together, in which I may say that the misfortune was chiefly mine, since I had really nothing to do with the matter, and yet shared all the trouble. However, I should have shared the honour and profit in case of success, so that I have no right to grumble. The facts were that Barrie had promised Mr. D'Oyly Carte that he would provide the libretto of a light opera for the Savoy. This was in the Gilbert days, when such a libretto was judged by a very high standard. It was an extraordinary commission for him to accept, and I have never yet been able to understand why he did so, unless, like Alexander, he wanted fresh worlds to conquer. On this occasion, however, he met with a disastrous repulse, and the opera Jane Annie, to which I alluded in an early chapter, was one of the few failures in his brilliant career. I was brought into the matter because Barrie's health failed on account of some family bereavement. I had an urgent telegram from him at Aldborough, and going there I found him very worried because he had bound himself by this contract, and he felt in his present state unable to go forward with it. There were to be 2 acts, and he had written the first one, and had the rough scenario of the second, with the complete sequence of events, if one may call it a sequence. Would I come in with him and help him to complete it as part author? Of course, I was very happy to serve him in any way. My heart sank, however, when after giving the promise, I examined the work. The only literary gift which Barrie has not got is the sense of poetic rhythm, and the instinct for what is permissible in verse. Ideas and wit were in abundance, but the plot itself was not strong, though the dialogue and the situations also were occasionally excellent. I did my best and wrote the lyrics for the second act, and much of the dialogue, but it had to take the predestined shape. The result was not good. However, the actual comradeship of production was very amusing and interesting, and our failure was mainly painful to us because it let down the producer and the cast. We were well abused by the critics, but Barrie took it all in the bravest spirit. I find in looking over my papers a belated statement of account from Barrie, which is good reading. In account with Mr. J. M. Barrie. Y. A. £1 lent at station. Cause of delay. Object moving too fast. Remarks. Doyle says he lent it. B. Y. £12 Jane Annie on tour. Cause of delay. Moving or swaying of Kodak. Remarks. Better late than never. C. Y. £30 6 shillings and 4 pence. Heaven knows. Cause of delay: failure to pull cord. Remarks: Doyle gets 2/5 of a penny beyond his share. Our associations were never so closely renewed, but through all my changing life I have had a respect and affection for Barry which were, I hope, mutual. How I collaborated with him at cricket as well as at work is told in my chapter on sport. Henry Irving is one of the other great men who I have met at close quarters, for his acting of Gregory Brewster brought us in contact. When he was producing Coriolanus, he came down to Hindhead and used to drop in of an evening. He was fond of a glass of port. Indeed, he was one of the 4 great men who were stated, probably untruly, by the Honourable G. Russell to drink a bottle each night, being the only trait which these great men had in common. The others, I remember, were Tennyson, Gladstone, and Moses Montefiore, and the last, I believe, was really true. Like all bad habits, it overtook the sinner at last, and he was cut off at the age of 116. Irving had a curious dry wit, which was occasionally sardonic and ill-natured. I can well believe that his rehearsals were often the occasion for heartburnings among the men and tears among the ladies. The unexpectedness of his remarks took one aback. I remember when my friend Hamilton sat up with me into the wee smart hours with the famous man. He became rather didactic on the subject of the deity or the universe, or some other tremendous topic, which he treated very solemnly and at great length. Irving sat with his intense eyes riveted upon the speaker's face, which encouraged Hamilton to go on, and on. When at last he had finished, Irving remarked, "What a low comedian you would have made." He wound up his visit by giving me his copy of Coriolanus, with all his notes and stage directions, a very precious relic. Many visions of old times rise before my eyes as I write, but my book would lose all proportion should I dwell upon them. I see Henley the formidable cripple, a red-bearded, loud-voiced buccaneer of a man who could only crawl, for his back appeared to be broken. He was a great poet and critic who seemed to belong to the roaring days of Marlowe, of the mighty line and the pot-house fray. I see Haggard, too, first as the young spruce diplomatist, later as the worn and bearded man, with strange vague tendencies to mysticism. Shaw, too, I see, with the pleasant silky voice and the biting phrase. It was strange that all the mild vegetables which formed his diet made him more pugnacious, and, I must add, more uncharitable than the carnivorous man, so that I have known no literary man who was more ruthless to other people's feelings. And yet to meet him was always to like him. He could not resist a bitter jest or the perverted pleasure of taking up an unpopular attitude. As an example, I remember Henry Irving telling me that when Shaw was invited to his father's funeral, he wrote in reply, "If I were at Westminster, Henry Irving would turn in his grave, just as Shakespeare would turn in his grave were Henry Irving at Stratford." I may not have it verbally exact, but that was near enough. It was the kind of outrageous thing that he would say, and yet one can forgive him all when one reads the glorious dialogue of some of his plays. He seems subhuman in emotion and superhuman in intellect. Shaw was always a thorn in Irving's side, and was usually the one jarring note among the chorus of praise which greeted each fresh production. At a first night at the Lyceum, those wonderful first nights which have never been equalled, the lanky Irishman with his greenish face, his red beard and his sardonic expression must have been like the death's head at the banquet to Irving. Irving ascribed this animosity to Shaw's pique because his plays were not accepted, but in this I am sure that he did an injustice. It was simply that contrary twist in the man which makes him delight in opposing whatever anyone else approved. There is nothing constructive in him, and he is bound to be in perpetual opposition. No one, for example, was stronger for peace and for non-militarism than he, and I remember that when I took the chair at a meeting at Hindhead to back up the Tsar's peace proposals at The Hague, I thought to myself as I spied Shaw in a corner of the room, well, this time at any rate he must be in sympathy. But far from being so, he sprang to his feet and put forward a number of ingenious reasons why these proposals for peace would be disastrous. Do what you could, he was always against you. Perhaps it is no bad thing to have the other point of view continually stated, and the British stand that sort of thing better than other nations. Had Shaw said in America what he said in England about the war whilst it was in progress, he would have been in personal danger. There were times, however, when his queer, contrary impulses became perfectly brutal in their working. One was at the time of the Titanic disaster, when he deliberately wrote a letter at a time when the wounds were raw, overwhelming everyone concerned with bitter criticism. I was moved to write a remonstrance, and we had a sharp debate in public, which did not in any way modify our kindly personal relations. I can recall a smaller, but even more unjustifiable example of his sour nature when he was staying at Hindhead. A garden party had been got up for some charity, and it included the woodland scenes of As You Like It, which were done by amateurs, and very well done too. Shaw, with no provocation, wrote a whole column of abuse in the local paper, spattering all the actors and their performance with ridicule, and covering them with confusion, though indeed they had nothing to be ashamed of. One mentions these things as characteristic of one side of the man, and as a proof, I fear, that the adoption by the world of a vegetarian diet will not bring unkind thoughts or actions to an end. But with it all, Shaw is a genial creature to meet, and I am prepared to believe that there is a human kindly side to his nature, though it has not been presented to the public. It took a good man to write St. Joan. Wells too I have known long, and indeed I must have often entered the draper's shop in which he was employed at Southsea, for the proprietor was a patient of mine. Wells is one of the great fruits which popular education has given us, since he came, as he is proud to state, from the heart of the people. His democratic frankness and complete absence of class feeling are occasionally embarrassing. I remember his asking me once if I had played cricket at Liphook. I said that I had. He said, "Did you notice an old fellow who acts as professional and groundkeeper?" I said that I had. "That was my father," said Wells. I was too much surprised to answer, and could only congratulate myself that I had made no unpleasant comments before I knew the identity of the old man. I have always had my doubts as to those elaborate forecasts of the future in which Wells indulges. He has, it is true, made a couple of good shots, which have already materialized in the tanks and in the machine which would deliver news in our own houses. But he has never shown any perception of the true meaning of the psychic, and for want of it his history of the world, elaborate and remarkable as it was, seemed to me to be a body without a soul. However, this also may be given him, and it will make his equipment complete. I remember discussing the matter with him, when George Gissing, Hornung, he and I foregathered in Rome early in this century. But apparently my words had no effect. Willie Hornung, my brother-in-law, is another of my vivid memories. He was a Dr. Johnson, without the learning, but with a finer wit. No one could say a neater thing, and his writings, good as they are, never adequately represented the powers of the man, nor the quickness of his brain. These things depend upon the time and the fashion, and go flat in the telling. But I remember how, when I showed him the record of someone who claimed to have done 100 yards under 10 seconds, he said, "It is a sprinter's error." Golf he could not abide, for he said it was unsportsmanlike to hit a sitting ball. His criticism upon my Sherlock Holmes was, "Though he might be more humble, there is no police like Holmes." I think I may claim that his famous character Raffles was a kind of inversion of Sherlock Holmes, Bunny playing Watson. He admits as much in his kindly dedication. I think there are few finer examples of short story writing in our language than these, though I confess I think they are rather dangerous in their suggestion. I told him so before he put pen to paper, and the result has, I fear, borne me out. You must not make the criminal a hero. Jerome too is an old friend. He is an adventurous soul, and at one time started a 4 in hand. I remember sitting on the top of it, and when one of the leaders turned right round and took a good look at the driver, I thought it was time to get down. Maxwell also is an old friend. He is, of course, the son of Miss Braddon, who married a publisher of that name. I respect him for doing a man's work in the war when, though he was 50 years of age and had led a sedentary life, he volunteered for a fighting battalion, a credit which he shares with A.E.W. Mason. Maxwell's work has always greatly appealed to me, and I have long looked upon him as the greatest novelist that we possess. I never met Robert Louis Stevenson in the flesh, though I owe so much to him in the literary spirit. Never can I forget the delight with which I read those early stories of his in the Cornhill, before I knew the name of the author. I still think that The Pavilion on the Links is one of the great short stories of the world, though there were alterations in the final form, which were all for the worse, and showed prudery upon the part of the publishers. Stevenson's last year at Edinburgh University must have just about coincided with my first one, and Barry must also have been in that grey old nest of learning, about the year 1876. Strange to think that I probably brushed elbows with both of them in the crowded portal. From his faraway home in Samoa, he seemed to keep a quick eye upon literary matters in England, and I had most encouraging letters from him in 1893 and 1894. "Oh, frolic fellow spookist," was his curious term of personal salutation in one of these, which showed that he shared my interest in psychic research, but did not take it very seriously. I cannot guess how at that time he had detected it, though I was aware that he had himself in early days acted as secretary to a psychic research, or rather to a spiritualist society in Edinburgh, which studied the remarkable mediumship of do-good. His letters to me consisted of kind appreciation of my work. "I have a great talent for compliment," he said, accompanied by a hateful and even a diabolic frankness. He had been retailing some of my Sherlock Holmes yarns to his native servants. I should not have thought that he needed to draw upon anyone else, and he complained to me in a comical letter of the difficulty of telling a story when you had to halt every moment to explain what a railway was, what an engineer was, and so forth. He got the story across in spite of all difficulties, and said he, "If you could have seen the bright feverish eyes of Simite, you would have tasted glory." But he explained that the natives took everything literally, and that there was no such thing as an imaginary story for them. I, who write this, have had the indiscretion to perpetuate a trifling piece of fiction, The Bottle Imp. Parties who come up to visit my mansion, after having admired the ceiling by Vander Putty and the tapestry by Gobling, manifest towards the end a certain uneasiness which proves them to be fellows of an infinite delicacy. They may be seen to shrug a brown shoulder, to roll up a speaking eye, and at last the secret bursts from them. "Where is the bottle?" In another letter he said that as I had written of my first book in The Idler, he also would do so. I could not hold back where the white plume of Conan Doyle waved in front of me. So at least I may boast that it is to me that the world owes the little personal sketch about Treasure Island, which appeared in that year. I cannot forget the shock that it was to me when, driving down the Strand in a hansom cab in 1896, I saw upon a yellow evening poster, "Death of Stevenson." Something seemed to have passed out of my world. I was asked by his executors to finish the novel St. Ives, which he had left 3/4 completed, but I did not feel equal to the task. It was done, however, and I understand very well done by Quillicooch. It is a desperately difficult thing to carry on another man's story, and must be a more or less mechanical effort. I had one experience of it when my neighbour at Hindhead, Grant Allen, was on his deathbed. He was much worried because there were 2 numbers of his serial, Hilda Wade, which was running in the Strand magazine, still uncompleted. It was a pleasure for me to do them for him, and so relieve his mind, but it was difficult collar work, and I expect they were pretty bad. Some time afterwards a stranger, who evidently confused Allen and me, wrote to say that his wife had given him a baby girl, and that in honour of me he was calling her Hilda Wade. he was really nearer the truth than appeared at first sight. I well remember that deathbed of Grant Allen's. He was an agnostic of a type which came very near atheism, though in his private life an amiable and benevolent man. Believing what he did, the approach of death must have offered rather a bleak prospect, and as he had paroxysms of extreme pain, the poor fellow seemed very miserable. I had often argued the case with him, I from a theistic and he from a negative point of view, but I did not intrude my opinions or disturb his mind at that solemn moment. Deathbed changes, though some clergy may rejoice in them, are really vain things. His brain, however, was as clear as ever, and his mind was occupied with all manner of strange knowledge, which he imparted in the intervals of his pain, in the curious high nasal voice which was characteristic. I can see him now, his knees drawn up to ease internal pain, and his long thin nose and reddish-grey goatee protruding over the sheet, while he croaked out, "Byzantine art, my dear Doyle, was of 3 periods, the middle one roughly coinciding with the actual fall of the Roman Empire, the characteristics of the first period," and so on, until he would give a cry, clasp his hands across his stomach, and wait till the pain passed before resuming his lecture. His dear little wife nursed him devotedly, and mitigated the gloom of those moments, which can be made the very happiest in life if one understands what lies before one. One thinks, as a contrast, of Dr. Hodgson's impatient cry, "I can hardly wait for death." Grant Allen's strong opinions in print, and a certain pleasure he took in defending outside positions, gave quite a false view of his character, which was gentle and benignant. I remember his coming to a fancy dress ball which we gave in the character of a cardinal, and in that guise all the quiet dignity of the man seemed to come out, and you realized how much our commonplace modern dress disguises the real man. He used to tell with great amusement how a couple, who afterwards became close friends, came first to call, and how as they waited on the doorstep the wife said to the husband, "Remember, John, if he openly blasphemes, I leave the room." He had, I remember, very human relations with the maids, who took a keen interest in their employer's scientific experiments. On one occasion these were connected with spiders, and the maid rushed into the drawing-room and cried, "Oh, sir, Araminta has got a wasp." Araminta was the name given to the big spider which he was observing at the time. Grant Allen had no actual call to write fiction, but his brain was agile enough to make some sort of job of anything to which it turned. On the other hand, as a popular scientist, he stood alone, or shared the honour with Samuel Lang. His only real success in fiction was the excellent short story John Creedy, where he combined science with fiction, with remarkable results. At the time when I and so many others turned to letters, there was certainly a wonderful vacancy for the newcomer. The giants of old had all departed. Thackeray, Dickens, Charles Reade, and Trollope were memories. There was no great figure remaining, save Hardy. The rising novelist was Mrs. Humphrey Ward, who was just beginning her career with Robert Elsmere, the first of that series of novels which will illuminate the later Victorian era more clearly than any historian ever can do. I think it was Hodgkin who said, when he read Count Robert of Paris, "Here have I been studying Byzantium all my life, and I never understood it until this blessed Scotch lawyer came along." That is the special prerogative of imagination. Trollope and Mrs. Ward have the whole Victorian civilization dissected and preserved. Then there were Meredith, unintelligible to most, and Walter Besant. There was Wilkie Collins too, with his fine stories of mystery, and finally there was James Payn. Payn was much greater than his books. The latter were usually rather mechanical, but to get at the real man one has to read such articles as his Literary Reminiscences, and especially his Backwater of Life. He had all that humorous view which nature seems to give as a compensation to those whose strength is weak. Had Paine written only essays, he would have rivalled Charles Lamb. I knew him best in his latter days, when he was crippled with illness, and his poor fingers so twisted with rheumatic arthritis that they seemed hardly human. He was intensely pessimistic as to his own fate. "Don't make any mistake, Doyle. Death is a horrible thing. Horrible. I suffer the agonies of the damned." But 5 minutes later he would have his audience roaring with laughter, and his own high treble laugh would be the loudest of all. His own ailments were frequently a source of mirth. I remember how he described the breaking of a blood vessel in Bournemouth, and how they carried him home on a litter. He was dimly conscious of the fir woods through which he passed. I thought it was my funeral, and that they had done me well in the matter of plumes. When he told the story he was so carried away by his sense of humour that he could hardly get the end out, and he finished up in a kind of scream. An American had called upon him at some late hour, and had discoursed upon Assyrian tablets. "I thought there was something to eat," he screamed. He was an excellent whist player, and the Baldwin Club used to send 3 members to his house on certain days, so that the old fellow should not go without his game. This game was very scientific. He would tell with delight how he asked some novice, "Do you play the penultimate?" To which the novice answered, "No, but my brother plays the American organ." Many of my generation of authors had reason to love him, for he was a human and kindly critic. His writing, however, was really dreadful. It was of him that the story was told that an author handed one of his letters to a chemist for a test. The chemist retired for a time, and then returned with a bottle and demanded £0.50. Better luck attended the man who received an illegible letter from a railway director. He used it as a free pass upon the line. Paine used to joke about his own writing, but it was a very real trouble when one could not make out whether he had accepted or rejected one's story. There was one letter in which I could only read the words "infringement of copyright." He was very funny when he described the work of the robust younger school. "I have received a story from blank," he said. 5,000 words, mostly damns. I knew Sir Henry Thompson, the famous surgeon, very well, and was frequently honoured by an invitation to his famous octave dinners, at which 8 carefully chosen male guests were always the company. They always seemed to me to be the most wonderful exhibitions of unselfishness. For Thompson was not allowed any alcohol, or anything save the most simple viands. Possibly, however, like Meredith and the bottle of Burgundy, he enjoyed some reflex pleasure from the enjoyment of others. He had been a wonderful viveur and judge of what was what, and I fear that I disappointed him, for I was much more interested in the conversation than the food, and it used to annoy me when some argument was interrupted in order to tell us that it was not ordinary ham, but a Westphalian wild boar that we were eating, and that it had been boiled in wine for precisely the right time prescribed by the best authorities. But it was part of his wonderful unselfish hospitality to make his guests realize exactly what it was that was set before them. I have never heard more interesting talk than at these male gatherings, for it is notorious that though ladies greatly improve the appearance of a feast, they usually detract from the quality of the talk. Few men are ever absolutely natural when there are women in the room. There was one special dinner, I fancy it was the 100th of the series, which was particularly interesting, as the Prince of Wales, now George V, was one of the 8, and gave us a most interesting account of the voyage round the world, from which he had just returned. Of the rest of the company, I can only recall Sir Henry Stanley, the traveller, and Sir Crichton Browne. 20 years later I met the King when he visited a trade exhibition, and I attended as one of the directors of Tuck's famous postcard firm. He at once said, "Why, I have not seen you since that pleasant dinner, when you sat next to me at Sir Henry Thompson's." It seemed to me to be a remarkable example of the royal gift of memory. I have not often occupied a chair among the seats of the mighty. My life has been too busy and too preoccupied to allow me to stray far from my beaten path. The mention of the prince, however, reminds me of the one occasion when I was privileged to entertain, or to attempt to entertain, the present Queen. It was at a small dinner to which I was invited by the courtesy of Lord Middleton, whose charming wife, once Madeleine Stanley, daughter of Lady Helier, I could remember since her girlhood. Upon this occasion the Prince and Princess came in after dinner, the latter sitting alone at one end of the room with a second chair beside her own, which was occupied successively by the various gentlemen who were to be introduced to her. I was led up in due course, made my bow, and sat down at her request. I confess that I found it heavy going at first, for I had heard somewhere that royalty has to make the first remark, and had it been the other way, there was such a gulf between us that I should not have known where to begin. However, she was very pleasant and gracious, and began asking me some questions about my works, which brought me on to very easy ground. Indeed, I became so interested in our talk that I was quite disappointed when Mr. John Morley was led up, and I realized that it was time for me to vacate the chair. There was another amusing incident on that eventful evening. I had been asked to take in Lady Curzon, whose husband, then Viceroy of India, had been unable to attend. The first couple had passed in, and there was a moment's hesitation as to who should go next. But Lady Curzon and I were nearest the door, so possibly with some little encouragement from the lady, we filed through. I thought nothing of the incident, but some great authority upon these matters came to me afterwards in great excitement. "Do you know," he said, "that you have established a precedent and solved one of the most difficult and debatable matters of etiquette that has ever caused ill feeling in British society? The Lord Chancellor and the College of Heralds should be much obliged to you, for you have given them a definite lead. There has never been so vexed a question as to whether a vice-reine, when she is away from the country where she represents royalty, shall take precedence over a duchess. There was a duchess in the room, but you, by your decided action, have settled the matter forever. So who shall say that I have done nothing in my life?" Lights of the law whom I have met from time to time, I think that Sir Henry Hawkins, then become Lord Bampton, made the most definite impression. I met him at a weekend gathering at Cliveden, when Mr. Astor was our host. On the first night at dinner, before the party had shaken down into mutual acquaintance, the ex-judge, very old and as bald as an ostrich egg, was seated opposite, and was wreathed with smiles as he made himself agreeable to his neighbour. His appearance was so jovial that I remarked to the lady upon my left, "It is curious to notice the appearance of our vis-à-vis, and to contrast it with his reputation," alluding to his sinister record as an inexorable judge. She seemed rather puzzled by my remark, so I added, "Of course you know who he is?" "Yes," said she. "His name is Conan Doyle, and he writes novels." I was hardly middle-aged at the time, and at my best physically, so that I was amused at her mistake, which arose from some confusion in the list of guests. I put my dinner card up against her wine-glass, so after that we got to know each other. Hawkins was a most extraordinary man, and so capricious that one never knew whether one was dealing with Jekyll or with Hyde. It was certainly Hyde when he took 11 hours summing up in the Penge case, and did all a man could do to have all 4 of the prisoners condemned to death. Sir Edward Clarke was so incensed at his behaviour on this occasion that he gave notice, when Hawkins retired from the bench, that if there were the usual complimentary ceremonies he would protest, so they were dropped. I might, on the other hand, illustrate the Jekyll side of him by a story which he told me with his own lips. A prisoner had a pet mouse. One day the brute of a warder deliberately trod upon it. The prisoner caught up his dinner knife and dashed at the warder, who only just escaped, the knife stabbing the door as it closed behind him. Hawkins, as judge, wanted to get the man off, but the attempt at murder was obvious, and the law equally clear. What was he to do? In his charge to the jury he said, "If a man tries to kill another in a way which is on the face of it absurd, it becomes a foolish rather than a criminal act. If, for example, a man in London discharged a pistol to hurt a man in Edinburgh, we could only laugh at such an offence. So also when a man stabs an iron-plated door while another man is at the other side of it, we cannot take it seriously. The jury, who were probably only too glad to follow such a lead, brought in a verdict of not guilty. Another distinguished man of the law who left a very clear impression upon my mind was Sir Francis Jeune, afterwards Lord St. Helier. I attended several of Lady Jeune's famous luncheon parties, which were quite one of the outstanding institutions of London, like Gladstone's breakfasts in the last quarter of the 19th century. I am indebted to this lady for very many kind actions. Her husband always impressed me with his gentle wisdom and with his cultivated taste. He told me that if every copy of Horace were destroyed, he thought that he could reconstruct most of it from memory. He presided over the divorce courts, and I remember upon one occasion I said to him, "You must have a very low opinion of human nature, Sir Francis, since the worst side of it is forever presented towards you." "On the contrary," said he very earnestly, "my experience in the divorce courts has greatly raised my opinion of humanity. There is so much chivalrous self-sacrifice and so much disposition upon the part of everyone to make the best of a bad business that it is extremely edifying. This view seemed to me to be worth recording." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Memories and Adventures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by a fine voice. Memories and Adventures by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 24. Some Recollections of Sport. Racing, shooting, a fish story, boxing, past and present, Carpentier and France, the Reno fight, football, golf with the Sirdar, billiards, cricket, W.G. Grace, queer experiences, tragic matches, humiliation, success in Holland, Barry's team, a precedent, motor accidents, Prince Henry tour, aviation, the balloon and the aeroplane, ski, over a precipice, rifle shooting. It is here, before we approach what Maxwell has called the Great Interruption, that I may perhaps break my narrative in order to interpolate a chapter upon the general subject of my experiences of sport, which have taken up an unappreciable part of my life, added greatly to its pleasure, and which can be better treated as a whole than recounted seriatim. It may best be fitted in at this spot, as my sporting life, one way and another, may be said to have reached its modest zenith about that time. As one grows old, one looks back at one's career in sport as a thing completed. Yet I have at least held on to it as long as I could, for I played a hard match of association football at 44, and I played cricket for 10 years more. I have never specialised, and have therefore been a second-rater in all things. I have made up for it by being an all-rounder, and have had, I dare say, as much fun out of sport as many an adept. It would be odd if a man could try as many games as I for so many years without having some interesting experiences, or forming a few opinions which would bear recording and discussion. And first of all, let me damn the sins I have no mind to, by recording what most of my friends will regard as limitation. I never could look upon flat racing as a true sport. Sport is what a man does, not what a horse does. Skill and judgment are shown, no doubt, by the professional jockeys, but I think it may be argued that in 9 cases out of 10, the best horse wins, and would have equally won, could his head be kept straight, had there been a dummy on his back. But making every allowance on the one side for what human qualities may be called forth, and for any improvement of the breed of horses, though I am told that the same pains in other directions would produce infinitely more fruitful and generally useful results, and putting on the other side the demoralization from betting, the rascality among some bookmakers, and the collection of undesirable characters brought together by a race meeting, I cannot avoid the conclusion that the harm greatly outweighs the good from a broadly national point of view. Yet I recognize, of course, that it is an amusement which lies so deeply in human nature, the oldest perhaps of all amusements which have come down to us, that it must have its place in our system until the time may come when it will be gradually modified, developing perhaps some purifying change, as prize-fighting did when it turned to contests with the gloves. I have purposely said flat racing because I think a stronger case, though not perhaps an entirely sound one, could be made out for steeplechasing. Eliminate the mob and the money, and then, surely among feats of human skill and hardihood, there are not many to match that of the winner of a really stiff point-to-point, while the man who rides at the huge barriers of the Grand National has a heart for anything. As in the old days of the ring, it is not the men nor the sport, but it is the followers who cast a shadow on the business. Go down to Waterloo and meet any returning race train if you doubt it. If I have alienated half my readers by my critical attitude to the turf, I shall probably offend the other half by stating that I cannot persuade myself that we are justified in taking life as a pleasure. To shoot for the pot must be right, since man must feed, and to kill creatures which live upon others, the hunting of foxes, for example, must also be right, since to slay one is to save many, but the rearing of birds in order to kill them, and the shooting of such sensitive and inoffensive animals as hares and deer, cannot, I think, be justified. I must admit that I shot a good deal before I came to this conclusion. Perhaps the fact, while it prevents my assuming any airs of virtue, will give my opinion greater weight, since good shooting is still within my reach, and I know nothing more exhilarating than to wait on the borders of an autumn-tinted wood, to hear the crackling advance of beaters, to mark the sudden whir and the yell of "Mark over," and then, over the topmost branches, to see a noble cock pheasant whizzing downwind at a pace which pitches him 100 yards behind you when you have dropped him. But when your moment of exultation is over, and you note what a beautiful creature he is, and how one instant of your pleasure has wrecked him, you feel that you had better think no longer if you mean to slip 2 more cartridges into your gun and stand by for another. Worse still is it when you hear the childlike wail of the wounded hare. I should think that there are few sportsmen who have not felt a disgust at their own handiwork when they have heard it. So too when you see the pheasant fly on with his legs showing beneath him, a sign that he is hard hit. He drops into the thick woods and is lost to sight. Perhaps it is as well for your peace of mind that he should be lost to thought also. Of course, one is met always by the perfectly valid argument that the creature would not live at all if it were not for the purposes of sport, and that it is presumably better from their point of view that they should eventually meet a violent death than that they should never have existed. No doubt this is true, but there is another side of the question as to the effect of the sport upon ourselves, whether it does not blunt our own better feelings, harden our sympathies, brutalise our natures. A coward can do it as well as a brave man. A weakling can do it as well as a strong man. There is no ultimate good from it. Have we a moral right, then, to kill creatures for amusement? I know many of the best and most kind-hearted men who do it, but still I feel that in a more advanced age it will no longer be possible. And yet I am aware of my own inconsistency when I say I am in sympathy with fishing, and would gladly have a little if I knew where to get it. And yet is it wholly inconsistent? Is a cold-blooded creature of low organisation like a fish to be regarded in the same way as the hare, which cries out in front of the beagles, or the deer, which may carry the rifle bullet away in its side? If there is any cruelty, it is surely of a much less degree. Besides, is it not the sweet solitude of nature, the romantic quest, rather than the actual capture, which appeals to the fisherman? One thinks of the stories of trout and salmon which have taken another fly within a few minutes of having broken away from a former one, and one feels that their sense of pain must be very different from our own. I once had the best of an exchange of fishing stories, which does not sound like a testimonial to my veracity. It was in a Birmingham inn, and a commercial traveller was boasting of his success. I ventured to back the weight of the last 3 fish which I had been concerned in catching against any day's take of his lifetime. He closed with the bet and quoted some large haul, £100 or more. "Now, sir," he asked triumphantly, "what was the weight of your 3 fish?" "Just over 200 tons, I answered. "Whales?" "Yes, 3 Greenland whales." "I give you best," he cried, "but whether as a fisherman or as a teller of fish stories, I am not sure." As a matter of fact, I had only returned that year from the Arctic seas, and the 3 fish in question were in truth the last which I had helped to catch. My experiences during my Arctic voyage, both with whales and bears, I have already touched upon, so I will not refer to them again, though it was the greatest period of sport which has ever come my way. I have always been keen upon the noble old English sport of boxing, and though of no particular class myself, I suppose I might describe my form as that of a fair average amateur. I should have been a better man had I taught less and learned more, but after my first tuition I had few chances of professional teaching. However, I have done a good deal of mixed boxing among many different types of men, and had as much pleasure from it as from any form of sport. It stood me in good stead aboard the whaler. On the very first evening I had a strenuous bout with the steward, who was an excellent sportsman. I heard him afterwards, through the partition of the cabin, declare that I was "the best surgeon we've had, Colin. He's black my ee." It struck me as a singular test of my medical ability, but I dare say it did no harm. I remember when I was a medical practitioner going down to examine a man's life for insurance in a little Sussex village. He was the gentleman farmer of the place, and a most sporting and jovial soul. It was a Saturday, and I enjoyed his hospitality that evening, staying over till Monday. After breakfast it chanced that several neighbours dropped in, one of whom, an athletic young farmer, was fond of the gloves. Conversation soon brought out the fact that I had a weakness in the same direction. The result was obvious. 2 pairs of gloves were hunted from some cupboard, and in a few minutes we were hard at it, playing light at first and letting out as we warmed. It was soon clear that there was no room inside a house for 2 heavyweights, so we adjourned to the front lawn. The main road ran across the end of it, with a low wall of just the right height to allow the village to rest its elbows on it and enjoy the spectacle. We fought several very brisk rounds, with no particular advantage either way, but the contest always stands out in my memory for its queer surroundings and the old English picture in which it was set. It is one of several curious by-battles in my career. I recollect another, where another man and I, returning from a ball at 5 of a summer morning, went into his room and fought in our dress clothes several very vigorous rounds as a wind-up to the evening's exercise. They say that every form of knowledge comes useful sooner or later. Certainly my own experience in boxing and my very large acquaintance with the history of the prize ring found their scope when I wrote Rodney Stone. No one but a fighting man would ever, I think, quite understand or appreciate some of the detail. A friend of mine read the scene where Boy Jim fights Burks to a prize fighter as he lay in what proved to be his last illness. The man listened with growing animation until the reader came to the point where the second advises Boy Jim, in technical jargon, how to get at his awkward antagonist. "That's it! By God, he's got him!" shouted the man in the bed. It was an incident which gave me pleasure when I heard it. I have never concealed my opinion that the old prize ring was an excellent thing from a national point of view, exactly as glove fighting is now. Better that our sports should be a little too rough than that we should run a risk of effeminacy. But the ring outlasted its time. It was ruined by the villainous mobs who cared nothing for the chivalry of sport or the traditions of British fair play as compared with the money gain which the contest might bring. Their blackguardism drove out the good men, the men who really did uphold the ancient standards, and so the whole institution passed into rottenness and decay. But now the glove contests carried on under the discipline of the national sporting or other clubs perpetuate the noble old sport without a possibility of the more evil elements creeping into it once more. An exhibition of hardihood without brutality, of good-humoured courage without savagery, of skill without trickery, is, I think, the very highest which sport can give. People may smile at the mittens, but a 20-round contest with 4-ounce gloves is quite as punishing an ordeal as one could wish to endure. There is as little room for a coward as in the rougher days of old, and the standard of endurance is probably as high as in the average prize fight. One wonders how our champions of today would have fared at the hands of the heroes of the past. I know something of this end of the question, for I have seen nearly all the great boxers of my time, from J.L. Sullivan down to Tommy Burns, Carpentier, Bombardier Wells, Beckett and that little miracle Jimmy Wilde. But how about the other end, the men of old? Wonderful Jem Mace was the only link between them. On the one hand he was supreme in the 60s as a knuckle fighter. On the other he gave the great impetus to glove fighting in America, and more especially in Australia, which has brought over such champions as Frank Slavin and Fitzsimmons, who, through Mace's teaching, derived straight from the classic line of British boxers. He of all men might have drawn a just comparison between the old and the new. But even his skill and experience might be at fault, for it is notorious that many of the greatest fighters under the old regime were poor hands with the mittens. Men could bang poor Tom Sayers all around the ring with the gloves, who would not have dared to get over the ropes had he been without them. I have seen Mace box, and even when over 60 it is wonderful how straight was his left, how quick his feet, and how impregnable his guard. After the Great War one can see that those of us who worked for the revival of boxing wrought better than we knew, for at the supreme test of all time, the test which has settled the history of the future, it has played a marked part. I do not mean that a man used his fists in the war, but I mean, and every experienced instructor will, I am sure, endorse it, that the combative spirit and aggressive quickness gave us the attacking fire and helped especially in bayonet work. But it was to our allies of France that the chief advantage came. I believe that Carpentier, the boxer, did more to win the war for France than any other man save the actual generals or politicians. The public proof that a Frenchman could be at the very head of his class, as Ledoux was also at a lighter weight, gives a physical self-respect to a nation which tinges the spirit of every single member of it. It was a great day for France when English sports, boxing, rugby football and others came across to them, and when a young man's ideal ceased to be amatory adventure with an occasional duel. England has taught Europe much, but nothing of more value than this. To return to my own small experiences of the game, I might have had one very notable one, for I was asked to referee the great contest when the champions of the white and black races fought for what may prove to be almost the last time. My first intimation was a cable, followed by the following letter. New York, December the 9th, 1909. My dear Sir, I hope you will pardon the liberty I took as a stranger in cabling to you, asking if you would act as the championship battle between Jeffries and Johnson. The fact is that when the articles were signed recently, your name was suggested for referee, and Tex Rickard, promoter of the fight, was greatly interested, as were many others. I believe it will interest you to know that the opinion was unanimous that you would do admirably in the position. In a voting contest, several persons sent in your name as their choice. Believe me, among sporting men of the best class in America, you have many strong admirers. Your splendid stories of the ring, and your avowed admiration for the great sport of boxing, have made you thousands of friends. It was because of this extremely friendly feeling for you in America that I took the liberty of cabling to you. I thank you for your reply. It would indeed rejoice the hearts of the men in this country if you were at the ringside when the great Negro fighter meets the white man Jeffries for the world's championship. I am, my dear sir, yours sincerely, Irving Jefferson Lewis, Managing Director, New York Morning Telegraph. I was much inclined to accept this honourable invitation, though my friends pictured me as winding up with a revolver at one ear and a razor at the other. However, the distances and my engagements presented a final bar. If boxing is the finest single-man sport, I think that rugby football is the best collective one. Strength, courage, speed and resource are great qualities to include in a single game. I have always wished that it had come more my way in life, but my football was ruined, as many a man's is, by the fact that at my old school they played a hybrid game peculiar to the place, with excellent points of its own, but unfitting the youngster for any other. All these local freak games, wall games, Winchester games and so on are national misfortunes, for while our youths are wasting their energies upon them, those precious early energies which make the instinctive players, the young South African or New Zealander is brought up on the real universal rugby, and so comes over to pluck a few more laurel leaves out of our depleted wreath. In Australia I have seen in Victoria a hybrid, though excellent game of their own, but they have had the sense in other parts to fall into line, and are already taking the same high position which they hold in other branches of sport. I hope that our headmasters will follow the same course. In spite of my wretched training, I played for a short time as a forward in the Edinburgh University team, but my want of knowledge of the game was too heavy a handicap. Afterwards I took to association and played first goal and then back for Portsmouth, when that famous club was an amateur organisation. Even then we could put a very fair team in the field, and were runners-up for the County Cup the last season that I played. In the same season I was invited to play for the county. I was always too slow, however, to be a really good back, though I was a long and safe kick. After a long hiatus I took up football again in South Africa and organised a series of inter-hospital matches in Bloemfontein, which helped to take our minds away from enteric. My old love treated me very scurvily, however, for I received a foul from a man's knee which buckled two of my ribs and brought my games to a close. I have played occasionally since, but there is no doubt that as a man grows older, a brisk charge shakes him up as it never did before. Let him turn to golf and be thankful that there is still one splendid game which can never desert him. There may be objections to the Royal and Ancient, but a game which takes 4 miles of country for the playing must always have a majesty of its own. Personally, I was an enthusiastic but a very inefficient golfer, a 10 at my best, and at my worst outside the pale of all decent handicaps. But surely it is a great testimony to the qualities of a game when a man can be both enthusiastic and inefficient. It is a proof at least that a man plays for the game's sake, and not for personal kudos. Golf is the coquette of games. It always lures one on, and always evades one. 10 years ago I thought I had nearly got it. I hope so today, but my scoring cards will show, I fear, that the coquette has not yet been caught. The elderly lover cannot hope to win her smile. I used in my early golfing days to practice on the very rudimentary links in front of the Menor Hotel, just under the pyramids. It was a weird course where, if you sliced your ball, you might find it bunkered in the graves of some Rameses or Thothmes of old. It was here, I believe, that the more cynical stranger, after watching my energetic but ineffectual game, remarked that he had always understood that there was a special tax for excavating in Egypt. I have a pleasant recollection of Egyptian golf in a match played with the late Sirdar, then head of the intelligence department. When my ball was teed, I observed that his negro caddy pointed 2 fingers at it and spat, which meant, as I was given to understand, that he cursed it for the rest of the game. Certainly I got into every hazard in the course, though I must admit that I have accomplished that when there was no Central African curse upon me. Those were the days before the reconquest of the Sudan, and I was told by Colonel Wingate, as he then was, that his spies coming down from Omdurman not infrequently delivered their messages to him while carrying his golf clubs, to avoid the attention of the Khalifa's spies who abounded in Cairo. On this occasion the Sirdar beat me well, but with a Christian caddie I turned the tables on him at Dunbar, and now we have signed articles to play off the rubber at Khartoum, no cursing allowed. When that first match was played, we should as soon have thought of arranging to play golf in the moon. Every now and then I give up the game in disgust at my own incompetence, but only to be lured on once more. Hunting in an old desk, I came upon an obituary which I had written for my game at some moment of special depression. It ran, "Sacred to the memory of my golf." It was never strong, being permanently afflicted with a deformed stance and an undeveloped swing. After long weakness, cheerfully borne, it finally succumbed, and was buried in the 18th hole, regretted by numerous caddies. However, it is out and about once more, none the worse for this premature interment. There is said to be a considerable analogy between golf and billiards, so much so that success in the one generally leads to success in the other. Personally, I have not found it so, for though I may claim, I suppose, to be above the average amateur at billiards, I am probably below him in golf. I have never quite attained the 3-figure break, but I have so often topped the 80, and even the 90, that I have lived in constant hope. My friend, the late General Drayson, who was a great authority on the game, used to recommend that every player should ascertain what he called his decimal, by which he meant how many innings it took him, whether scoring or not, to make 100. The number, of course, varies with the luck of the balls and the mood of the player, but taken over a dozen or 20 games, it gives a fair average idea of the player's form, and a man by himself can in this way test his own powers. If, for example, a player could, on an average, score 100 in 20 innings, then his average would be 5, which is very fair amateur form. If a man finds his decimal rise as high as 10 over a sequence of games, he may be sure that he can hold his own against most players that he is likely to meet. I dare say my own decimal, when I was in practice, would be from 6 to 8. I was never good enough for the big matches, and though I once went in for the amateur championship, it was not out of any illusions about my game, but because I was specially asked to do so, as it was advisable to strengthen the undoubted amateur element in the contest. By the luck of a bye, and by beating a player who was about my own form, I got into the 3rd round, when I ran across Mr. Evans, who eventually reached the final with my scalp as well as several others, at his girdle. I made 650 against his 1,000, which, as I was not helped by a bad fall from a motorbike a few days before, was as much as I could expect. 42 off the red was my best effort. Surely billiards is the king of all indoor games, and should have some writer who would do for it in prose what John Nyren did for cricket. I have never seen any worthy appreciation of its infinite varieties, from the forcing losing hazard which goes roaring into a top pocket with a clash upon the rail, to the feather stroke so delicate that it is only the quiver of reflected light upon the object ball which shows that it has indeed been struck. Greatest of all is the ball heavily loaded with side, which drifts down the long cushion and then is sucked against every apparent law into the pocket as though it were the centre of a whirlpool. Mr. E. V. Lucas is one who could do it with discernment. I have one funny recollection of billiards when I wandered into some small hotel in a south coast watering place, and for want of something to do, played the marker. He was a pompous person in a frock coat, with a very good opinion of his own game, which was really ruined by a habit he had of jerking. I won the match, which was not difficult to do, and then I thought it a kindness to point out to the man how he could improve his game. He took this badly, however, and hinted that he allowed gentlemen who played him to get the better of him. This in turn annoyed me, so I said, "Look here, I will come in after dinner, and you can show all you can do, and you shall have a sovereign if you win." After dinner his game was worse than ever, while I had amazing luck and made the 100 in about 3 shots. As I put on my coat and was leaving the room, the queer little fellow sidled up to me and said, "I beg pardon, sir, but is your name Roberts?" My earliest recollection of cricket is not a particularly pleasant one. When I was a very small boy at a preparatory school, I was one of a group of admirers who stood around watching a young cricketer who had just made his name hitting big hits off the school bowlers. One of the big hits landed on my kneecap, and the cricketer in his own famous arms carried me off to the school infirmary. The name, Tom Emmett, lingers in my memory, though it was some years before I appreciated exactly what he stood for in the game. I think, like most boys, I would rather have been knocked down by a first-class cricketer than picked up by a second-rater. That was the beginning of my acquaintance with a game which has on the whole given me more pleasure during my life than any other branch of sport. I have ended by being its victim, for a fast bowler some years ago happened to hit me twice in the same place under my left knee, which has left a permanent weakness. I have had as long an inning as one could reasonably expect, and carry many pleasant friendships and recollections away with me. I was a keen cricketer as a boy, but in my student days was too occupied to touch it. Then I took it up again, but my progress was interrupted by work and travel. I had some cause, therefore, to hold on to the game, as I had lost so much of it in my youth. Finally, I fulfilled a secret ambition by getting into the fringe of first-class cricket, though rather perhaps through the good nature of others than my own merits. However, I can truly say that in the last season, when I played some first-class cricket, including matches against Kent, Derbyshire and the London County, I had an average of 32 for those games, so I may claim to have earned my place. I was more useful, however, in an amateur team, for I was a fairly steady and reliable bowler, and I could generally earn my place in that department, while with the MCC the professional talent is usually so strong that the amateur who fails in batting, and is not a particularly good field, has no chance of atoning with the ball. Yet even with the MCC I have occasionally had a gleam of success. Such a one came some years ago when the team presented me with a little silver hat for getting 3 consecutive clean bowled wickets against the gentlemen of Warwick. One of my victims explained his downfall by assuring me that he had it thoroughly in his head that I was a left-handed bowler, and when the ball came from my right hand, he was too bewildered to stop it. The reason is not so good as that of an artist who, when I had bowled him out, exclaimed, "Who can play against a man who bowls in a crude pink shirt against an olive-green background?" A bowler has many days when everything is against him, when a hard, smooth wicket takes all the spin and devil out of him, when he goes all round and over the wicket, when lofted balls refuse to come to hand, or if they do come, refuse to stay. But, on the other hand, he has his recompense, with many a stroke of good fortune. It was in such a moment that I had the good luck to get the wicket of W.G. Grace, the greatest of all cricketers. W.G. had his speedy revenge. There was nothing more childlike and bland than that slow, tossed-up bowling of his, and nothing more subtle and treacherous. He was always on the wicket or about it, never sent down a really loose ball, worked continually a few inches from the leg, and had a perfect command of length. It was the latter quality which was my downfall. I had made some 30 or 40, and began to relax in the deep respect with which I faced the doctor's deliveries. I had driven him for 4, and jumped out at him again the next ball. Seeing my intention, as a good bowler does, he dropped his ball a foot or 2 shorter. I reached it with difficulty, but again I scored 4. By this time I was very pleased with myself, and could see no reason why every one of these delightful slows should not mean a 4 to me. Out I danced to reach the next one on the half-volley. It was tossed a little higher up in the air, which gave the delusion that it was coming right up to the bat, but as a matter of fact it pitched well short of my reach, broke sharply across, and Lilly, the wicket-keeper, had my bails off in a twinkling. One feels rather cheap when one walks from the middle of the pitch to the pavilion, longing to kick oneself for one's own foolishness all the way. I have only once felt smaller, and that was when I was bowled by A.P. Lucas, by the most singular ball that I have ever received. He propelled it like a quoit into the air to a height of at least 30 feet, and it fell straight and true onto the top of the bails. I have often wondered what a good batsman would have made of that ball. To play it, one would have needed to turn the blade of the bat straight up and could hardly fail to give a chance. I tried to cut it off my stumps, with the result that I knocked down my wicket and broke my bat, while the ball fell in the midst of this general chaos. I spent the rest of the day wondering gloomily what I ought to have done, and I am wondering yet. I have had two unusual experiences upon Lord's ground. One was that I got a century in the very first match that I played there. It was an unimportant game, it is true, but still the surprising fact remained. It was a heavy day, and my bat, still encrusted with the classic mud, hangs as a treasured relic in my hall. The other was less pleasant and even more surprising. I was playing for the club against Kent, and faced for the first time Bradley, who was that year one of the fastest bowlers in England. His first delivery I hardly saw, and it landed with a terrific thud upon my thigh. A little occasional pain is one of the chances of cricket, and one takes it as cheerfully as one can, but on this occasion it suddenly became sharp to an unbearable degree. I clapped my hand to the spot, and found to my amazement that I was on fire. The ball had landed straight on a small tin Vesta box in my trousers pocket, had splintered the box, and set the matches ablaze. It did not take me long to turn out my pocket and scatter the burning vestas over the grass. I should have thought this incident unique, but Alec Hearn, to whom I told it, assured me that he had seen more than one accident of the kind. W.G. was greatly amused. "Couldn't get you out. Had to set you on fire," he cried in the high voice, which seemed so queer from so big a body. There are certain matches which stand out in one's memory for their peculiar surroundings. One was a match played against Cape de Verde at that island, on the way to South Africa. There is an Atlantic telegraph station there, with a large staff, and they turn out an excellent 11. I understand that they played each transport as it passed, and that they had defeated all, including the guards. We made up a very fair team, however, under the captaincy of Lord Henry Scott, and after a hard fight we defeated the islanders. I don't know how many of our 11 left their bones in South Africa, 3 at least: Blasson, Douglas Forbes, who made our top score, and young Maxwell Craig never returned. I remember one even more tragic match in which I played for the Incogniti against Aldershot Division a few months before the African War. The regiments quartered there were those which afterwards saw the hardest service. Major Ray, who made the top score, was killed at Magersfontein. Young Stanley, who went in first with me, met his death in the yeomanry. Taking the two teams right through, I am sure that half the men were killed or wounded within 2 years. How little we could have foreseen it that sunny summer day. It is dangerous when an old cricketer begins to reminisce, because so much comes back to his mind. He has but to smell the hot rubber of our bat handle to be flooded with memories. They are not always glorious. I remember 3 ladies coming to see me play against one of the Bedford schools. The boys politely applauded as I approached the wicket. A very small boy lobbed up the first ball which I played at. It went up into the air and was caught at point by the very smallest boy I have ever seen in decent cricket. It seemed to me about a mile as I walked back from the wicket to the pavilion. I don't think those 3 ladies ever recovered their confidence in my cricketing powers. As I set off to this confession of failure, let me add a small instance of success, whereby, taking thought, I saved a minor international match. It was at The Hague in 1892, and the game was a wandering British team against Holland. The Dutch were an excellent sporting lot, and had one remarkable bowler in post humour, a left-hander, who had so huge a break with his slow ball that it was not uncommon for him to pitch the ball right outside the matting on which we played, and yet bring it on to the wicket. We won our various local matches without much difficulty, but we were aware that we should have a stiff fight with United Holland, the more so as Dutch hospitality was almost as dangerous to our play as Dutch cricket. So it proved, and we were in the position that with 4 wickets in hand they had only 15 runs to make with 2 batsmen well set. I had not bowled during the tour, for as we were a scratch team, mostly from the schoolmaster class, we did not know each other's capacity. Seeing, however, that things were getting desperate, I went the length of asking our skipper to give me a chance. I had observed that the batsmen had been very well taught by their English professional, and that they all played in most orthodox fashion with a perfectly straight bat. That was why I thought I might get them out. I brought every fielder round to the off, for I felt that they would not think it correct to pull, and I tossed up good length balls about a foot on the offside. It came off exactly as I expected. The pro had not told them what to do with that particular sort of tosh, and the 4 men were all caught for as many runs by mid-off or cover. The team, in their exultation, proceeded to carry me into the pavilion, but whether it was my 16 stone or the heat of the weather, they tired of the job midway and let me down with a crash which shook the breath out of me. So Holland was avenged. I played against them again when they came to England, and made 67, but got no wickets, for they had mastered the offside theory. Some of my quaintest cricket reminiscences are in connection with J.M. Barrie's team. The Allah Akbaris, or Lord Helpers, as we were called. We played in the old style, caring little about the game and a good deal about a jolly time and pleasant scenery. Broadway, the country home of Mr. Navarro and his wife, formerly Mary Anderson, the famous actress, was one of our favourite haunts, and for several years in succession we played the artists there. Bernard Partridge, Barrie, A.E.W. Mason, Abbey the academician, Blomfield the architect, Marriott Watson, Charles Whibley, and others of note took part, and there were many whimsical happenings, which were good fun if they were not good cricket. I thought all record of our games had faded from human ken, but lately a controversy was raised over Mr. Armstrong, the Australian captain, bowling the same man from opposite ends on consecutive overs. This led to the following paragraph in a Birmingham paper, which I may say entirely exaggerates my powers, but is otherwise correct. Barrie and Armstrong. I am not surprised that in the matter of Mr. Armstrong's conduct in bowling 2 consecutive overs from different ends, no reference has been made to the important precedent which on a similar occasion Sir James Barrie failed to establish, writes a correspondent of The Nation. The occasion was his captaincy, at Broadway, in Worcestershire, of an 11 of writers against a strong team of alleged artists. The circumstances were these. One side had compiled 72 runs, chiefly if not wholly contributed by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The sun worshippers had thereupon responded with an equal number of runs for the loss of all but their last wicket. The 9th wicket had fallen to the last ball of Sir Arthur's over, the other 8 having succumbed to the same performer, then in his prime. Actuated apparently by the belief that Sir Arthur was the only bowler of his side capable of taking or reaching a wicket, even in Worcestershire, Sir James thereupon put him on at the opposite end. Before, however, he could take a practice ball, a shout was heard from the artists' pavilion, and the 9 unengaged players were seen issuing from it to contest our captain's decision. After an exciting contest, it was ultimately given in their favour, with the result that the first ball of the new bowler was hit for 2, assisted by overthrows, and the innings and match were won by the artists. Of Barrie's team, I remember that it was printed at the bottom of our cards that the practice ground was in the National Observer Office. Mr. Abbey, the famous artist, usually captained against Barrie, and it was part of the agreement that each should have a full pitch to leg just to start his score. I remember my horror when by mistake I bowled a straight first ball to Abbey, and so broke the unwritten law as well as the wicket. Abbey knew nothing of the game, but Barrie was no novice. He bowled an insidious left-hand good-length ball coming from leg, which was always likely to get a wicket. Talking of bowling, I have twice performed the rare feat of getting all 10 wickets. Once it was against a London club, and once I ran through the side of a dragoon regiment at Norwich. My best performance at Lord's was 7 wickets for 51 against Cambridgeshire in 1904. Of fencing my experience has been limited, and yet I have seen enough to realise what a splendid, toughening exercise it is. I nearly had an ugly mishap when practising it, I had visited a medical man in Southsea who was an expert with the foils, and at his invitation had a bout with him. I had put on the mask and glove, but was loath to have the trouble of fastening on the heavy chest plastron. He insisted, however, and his insistence saved me from an awkward wound, for coming in heavily upon a thrust, his foil broke a few inches from the end, and the sharp point thus created went deeply into the pad which covered me. I learned a lesson that day. On the whole, considering the amount of varied sport which I have done, I have come off very well as regards bodily injury. 1 finger broken at football, 2 at cricket, one after the other in the same season. The disablement of my knee, that almost exhausts it. Though a heavy man and quite an indifferent rider, I have never hurt myself in a fair selection of falls in the hunting field and elsewhere. Once, as I have narrated, when I was down, the horse kicked me over the eye with his forefoot, but I got off with a rather ragged wound, though it might have been very much more serious. Indeed, when it comes to escapes, I have had more than my share of luck. One of the worst was in a motor accident, when the machine, which weighed over a ton, ran up a high bank, threw me out on a gravel drive below, and then, turning over, fell on top of me. The steering wheel projected slightly from the rest, and thus broke the impact, and undoubtedly saved my life, but it gave way under the strain, and the weight of the car settled across my spine, just below the neck, pinning my face down on the gravel, and pressing with such terrific force as to make it impossible to utter a sound. I felt the weight getting heavier moment by moment, and wondered how long my vertebrae could stand it. However, they did so long enough to enable a crowd to collect, and the car to be levered off me. I should think there are few who can say that they have held up a ton weight across their spine, and lived unparalysed to talk about it. It is an acrobatic feat which I have no desire to repeat. There is plenty of sport in driving one's own motor, and meeting the 101 unexpected roadside adventures and difficulties which are continually arising. These were greater a few years ago when motors were themselves less solidly and accurately constructed. Drivers were less skilled, and frightened horses were more in evidence. No invention of modern civilization has done so much for developing a man's power of resource and judgment as the motor. To meet and overcome a sudden emergency is the best of human training, and if a man is his own driver and mechanician on a fairly long journey, he can hardly fail to have some experience of it. I well remember, in the early days of motoring, going up to Birmingham to take delivery of my new 12-horsepower Wolseley. I had invested in the sort of peaked yachting cap which was considered the correct badge of the motorist in those days, but as I paced the platform of New Street Station, a woman removed any conceit I might have over my headgear by asking me peremptorily how the trains ran to Walsall. She took me for one of the officials. I got the car safely home, and no doubt it was a good car, as things went at that time. But the secret of safe brakes had not yet been discovered, and my pair used to brake as if they were glass. More than once I have known what it is to steer a car when it is flying backwards, under no control down a winding hill. Looking back at those days, it seems to me that I was under the car nearly as much as on the top of it, for every repair had to be done from below. There were few accidents from smashing my differential, seizing my engines, and stripping my gears, which I have not endured. It was a chain-driven machine, and I can well remember one absurd incident when the chain jumped the cogs and fell off. We were on a long slope of 3 miles, and ran on with the engine turned off, quite unconscious of what had occurred. When we reached level ground, the car naturally stopped, and we got out, opened the bonnet, tested the electricity, and were utterly puzzled as to what was amiss, when a yokel in a cart arrived waving our motive power over his head. He had picked it up on the road. Our descendants will never realise the terror of the horses at this innovation, nor the absurd scenes which it caused. On one occasion I was motoring down a narrow lane in Norfolk, with my mother in the open tonneau. Coming round a curve we came upon 2 carts, one behind the other. The leading horse, which had apparently never seen a motor before, propped his forelegs out, his ears shot forward, his eyes stared rigidly, and then in a moment he whirled round, ran up the bank, and tried to escape behind his comrade. This he could have done but for the cart, which he also dragged up the bank. Horse and cart fell sideways on the other horse and cart, and there was such a mixture that you could not disentangle it. The carts were full of turnips. These formed a top dressing over the interlaced shafts and the struggling horses. I sprang out and was trying to help the enraged farmer to get something right end up, when I glanced at my own car, which was almost involved in the pile. There was my dear old mother, sitting calmly, knitting in the midst of all the chaos. It was really like something in a dream. My most remarkable motor car experience was when I drove my own 16-horsepower Dietrich Lorraine in the International Road Competition organised by Prince Henry of Prussia in 1911. This affair is discussed later, when I come to the preludes of war. I came away from it with sinister forebodings. The impression left on my mind by the whole incident is shown by the fact that one of the first things I did when I got to London was to recommend a firm of which I am director to remove a large sum which it had lying in Berlin. I have no doubt that it would have continued to lie there and that we might have lost it. As to the contest itself, it ended in a British victory, which was owing to the staunch way in which we helped each other when in difficulties, while the Germans were more a crowd of individuals than a team. Their cars were excellent, and so was their driving. My own little car did very well, and only dropped marks at Sutton Bank in Yorkshire, that terrible hill, 1 in 3 at one point with a hairpin bend. When we finally panted out our strength, I put my lightweight chauffeur to the wheel, ran round and fairly boosted her up from behind, but we were fined so many marks for my leaving the driving wheel. Not to get up would have meant 3 times the forfeit, so my tactics were well justified. No doubt the coming science of aviation will develop the same qualities as motor driving to an even higher degree. It is a form of sport in which I have only aspirations and little experience. I had one balloon ascent in which we covered some 25 miles and ascended 6,000 feet, which was so delightful an expedition that I have always been eager for another, and a longer one. A man has a natural trepidation the first time he leaves the ground, but I remember that as I stood by the basket with the gas bag swinging about above me, and the assistant clinging to the ropes, someone pointed out an elderly gentleman and said, "That is the famous Mr. So-and-so, the aeronaut." I saw a venerable person, and I asked how many ascents he had made. "About 1,000, was the answer. No eloquence or reasoning could have convinced me so completely that I might get into the basket with a cheerful mind, though I will admit that for the first minute or so one feels very strange, and keeps an uncommonly tight grip of the side ropes. This soon passes, however, and one is lost in the wonder of the prospect, and the glorious feeling of freedom and detachment. As in a ship, it is the moment of nearing land once more which is the moment of danger, or at least of discomfort. But beyond a bump or two we came to rest very quietly in the heart of a Kentish hop field. I had one aeroplane excursion in rather early days, but the experience was not entirely a pleasant one. Machines were under-engined in those days, and very much at the mercy of the wind. We went up at Hendon, May the 25th, 1911, the date, but the machine was a heavy biplane, and though it went downwind like a swallow, it was more serious when we turned and found, looking down, that the objects below us were stationary, or even inclined to drift backwards. However, we got back to the field at last, and I think the pilot was as relieved as I. What impressed me most was the terrible racket of the propeller, comparing so unfavourably with the delicious calm of the balloon journey. There is one form of sport in which I have, I think, been able to do some practical good. For I can claim to have been the first to introduce skis into the Grisons division of Switzerland, or at least to demonstrate their practical utility as a means of getting across in winter from one valley to another. It was in 1894 that I read Nansen's account of his crossing of Greenland, and thus became interested in the subject of skiing. It chanced that I was compelled to spend that winter in the Davos Valley, and I spoke about the matter to Tobias Branger, a sporting tradesman in the village, who in turn interested his brother. We sent for skis from Norway, and for some weeks afforded innocent amusement to a large number of people who watched our awkward movements and complex tumbles. The Brangers made much better progress than I. At the end of a month or so we felt that we were getting more expert, and determined to climb the Jakobshorn, a considerable hill just opposite the Davos Hotel. We had to carry our unwieldy skis upon our backs until we had passed the fir trees which line its slopes. But once in the open we made splendid progress, and had the satisfaction of seeing the flags in the village dipped in our honour when we reached the summit. But it was only in returning that we got the full flavour of skiing. In ascending you shuffle up by long zigzags, the only advantage of your footgear being that it is carrying you over snow which would engulf you without it. But coming back you simply turn your long toes and let yourself go, gliding delightfully over the gentle slopes, flying down the steeper ones, taking an occasional cropper, but getting as near to flying as any earthbound man can. In that glorious air it is a delightful experience. Encouraged by our success with the Jakobshorn, we determined to show the utility of our accomplishment by opening up communications with Arosa, which lies in a parallel valley and can only be reached in winter by a very long and roundabout railway journey. To do this we had to cross a high pass and then drop down on the other side. It was a most interesting journey, and we felt all the pride of pioneers as we arrived in Arosa. I have no doubt that what we did would seem absurdly simple to Norwegians or others who were apt at the game, but we had to find things out for ourselves, and it was sometimes rather terrifying. The sun had not yet softened the snow on one sharp slope across which we had to go, and we had to stamp with our skis in order to get any foothold. On our left the snow slope ended in a chasm, from which a blue smoke or fog rose in the morning air. I hardly dared look in that direction, but from the corner of my eye I saw the vapour of the abyss. I stamped along, and the two gallant Switzers got on my left, so that if I slipped, the shock would come upon them. We had no rope by which we could link up. We got across all right, and perhaps we exaggerated the danger, but it was not a pleasant experience. Then I remember that we came to an absolute precipice, upon which no doubt the path zigzags in summer. It was not of course perpendicular, but it seemed little removed from it, and it had just slope enough to hold the snow. It looked impassable, but the Brangers had picked up a lot in some way of their own. They took off their skis, fastened them together with a thong, and on this toboggan they sat, pushing themselves over the edge and going down amid a tremendous spray of flying snow. When they had reached safety, they beckoned to me to follow. I had done as they did, and was sitting on my skis preparatory to launching myself, when a fearsome thing happened, for my skis shot from under me, flew down the slope, and vanished in huge bounds among the snow mounds beyond. It was a nasty moment, and the poor Brangers stood looking up at me some hundreds of feet below me in a dismal state of mind. However, there was no possible choice as to what to do, so I did it. I let myself go over the edge and came squattering down, with legs and arms extended to check the momentum. A minute later I was rolling covered with snow at the feet of my guides, and my skis were found some hundreds of yards away, so no harm was done after all. I remember that when we signed the hotel register, Tobias Branger filled up the space after my name, in which the new arrival had to describe his profession, by the words "sportersman," which I took as a compliment. It was at any rate more pleasant than the German description of my golf clubs, which went astray on the railway and turned up at last with the official description of Kinderspieler, child's toys, attached to them. To return to the skis, they are no doubt in very general use, but I think I am right in saying that these and other excursions of ours first demonstrated their possibilities to the people of the country, and have certainly sent a good many thousands of pounds since then into Switzerland. If my rather rambling career in sport has been of any practical value to anyone, it is probably in this matter, and also perhaps in the opening up of miniature rifle ranges in 1901, when the idea was young in this country, and when my Hindhead range was the pioneer and the model for many others. A pleasing souvenir of my work on rifle clubs is to be found in the Conan Doyle Cup, which was presented by my friend Sir John Langman, and is still shot for every year at Bisley by civilian teams. On the whole, as I look back, there is no regret in my mind for the time that I have devoted to sport. It gives health and strength, but above all, it gives a certain balance of mind, without which a man is not complete. To give and to take, to accept success modestly and defeat bravely, to fight against odds, to stick to one's point, to give credit to your enemy and value your friend, these are some of the lessons which true sport should impart. End of chapter 24.